Hi everyone. Tonight we're delving into the lingering twilight of an empire, often overshadowed by its illustrious predecessor, a realm that persisted for over a millennium after the West had crumbled, yet rarely receives the detailed, perhaps even painstakingly slow, attention it deserves. Imagine, if you will, the bustling streets of Constantinople, a city of 1 million souls at its zenith, a crucible of cultures, trade, and intricate theological debate, all swirling beneath the shadow of colossal walls that repelled invaders for centuries. Now, picture yourself as a merchant navigating those very thoroughfares, haggling over silks and spices, acutely aware that your survival, indeed, the very fabric of your daily existence, hung precariously on the intricate dance of imperial succession, the subtle shifts in theological dogma, and the relentless pressure from external forces. You probably wouldn't survive this era for long without an encyclopedic knowledge of Byzantine bureaucracy and a keen eye for subtle political machinations. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And feel free to post your location and local time in the comments. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on the fan to some soothing background music. And let's get started tonight. The enduring walls of Theodosius, Constantinople's unyielding embrace. The story of Constantinople, the crown jewel of the Byzantine Empire, is in many respects the story of its walls, not merely fortifications of stone and mortar, but a testament to strategic foresight, engineering prowess, and an unwavering belief in the city's divine protection. To truly appreciate the mundane yet profoundly significant details that allowed this city to endure for over 11 centuries, long after the Western Roman Empire had fragmented into a collection of barbarian kingdoms, one must first understand the almost obsessive focus on its defenses. Theodosius II, a relatively unassuming emperor who reigned from 408 to 450 CE, often gets the primary credit, though the groundwork for the city's impregnability was laid by his predecessors, most notably Constantine the Great himself. However, it was under Theodosius's long reign, or rather, under the influence of his remarkably capable Praetorian prefect, Anthemius, that the monumental land walls were conceived and constructed. Before the Theodosian walls, Constantinople relied on the Constantinian walls, built hastily by Constantine in the early 4th century. These earlier fortifications, while substantial for their time, were becoming increasingly inadequate as the city expanded rapidly, spilling beyond its initial boundaries. The population boom, driven by economic prosperity, strategic location, and imperial patronage, meant that large swaths of the burgeoning metropolis lay unprotected, vulnerable to the ever-present threat of barbarian incursions. It was a perilous situation, one that demanded a defensive structure on an unprecedented scale. Anthemius, a man of remarkable administrative acumen and a keen understanding of military logistics, recognized this existential threat. He envisioned a defensive system that would not merely repel attackers, but demoralize them. A series of layered defenses so formidable that any siege would become a protracted, resource-draining nightmare for the aggressor. This wasn't just about building a wall, it was about creating an urban fortress, a self-sustaining entity designed to weather any storm. The sheer scale of the project was astounding. Construction began around 413 CE and was largely completed within 5 years, a feat of engineering that beggars belief given the technology of the era. Imagine, for a moment, the logistical challenges sourcing colossal quantities of stone, timber, and mortar, organizing tens of thousands of laborers, both skilled and unskilled, coordinating their efforts over a 6.5 kilometer stretch of land, and doing all of this without the benefit of modern machinery or sophisticated communication networks. The workforce likely consisted of a combination of paid laborers, conscripted citizens, and perhaps even military personnel. Life for these workers would have been arduous, characterized by long hours, strenuous physical exertion, and the constant pressure of a demanding imperial deadline. Accidents would have been commonplace, and the relentless rhythm of construction would have permeated the city, a perpetual reminder of its ongoing vulnerability and the monumental effort required to secure its future. The clamor of hammers, the rasp of saws, the shouts of overseers, and the groaning of ox-drawn carts laden with building materials would have been the daily soundtrack of early 5th century Constantinople. What emerged from this colossal undertaking was a defensive masterpiece, an intricate system designed for layered defense, unlike anything seen before or since in the ancient world. The Theodosian walls were not a single barrier, but a triple line of fortifications, each designed to inflict maximum damage and delay on an approaching enemy. The outermost defense was a wide, deep ditch, approximately 20 meters wide and 10 meters deep, often filled with water. This ditch, known as the fossa, served not only as an obstacle, but also as a collection point for rainwater, forming a kind of moat that complicated any attempts at tunneling or approaching the walls. Beyond the ditch lay the peribolos, a broad, flat terrace that separated the ditch from the outer wall. This area was crucial for defense. It allowed Byzantine defenders to sortie out against besiegers or to rain down projectiles from the safety of the walls, making it a deadly killing ground for any attacking force. The first true defensive wall was the outer wall, or exoteikisma, standing around 5 meters high. This wall was dotted with towers spaced at regular intervals, typically around 50 meters apart. These towers, approximately 10 to 12 meters high, provided excellent vantage points for archers and slingers, allowing them to deliver a punishing hail of projectiles onto any enemy attempting to cross the peribolos. The top of the outer wall was equipped with a crenellated walkway, allowing defenders to move freely and direct their fire. But this was merely the first obstacle. Beyond the outer wall lay another open space, the peribolos proper, or more accurately, the inner peribolos, a kind of internal terrace between the outer and inner walls. This space, around 15-20 meters wide, served as a crucial buffer, preventing any initial breach of the outer wall from immediately compromising the main defense. It also provided a staging area for defenders, allowing them to reposition quickly or launch counterattacks. This strategic depth was a key element of the wall's effectiveness, ensuring that a breach in one line did not automatically spell disaster for the entire city. Finally, towering above all was the magnificent inner wall, the true heart of the Theodosian defenses. This monumental structure, 12 meters high and 5 meters thick, was constructed with a core of rubble and mortar faced with meticulously cut stone blocks, a construction technique known as opus caementicium, overlaid with brick and stone, creating a distinctively Byzantine striped appearance every 55 meters. Massive rectangular towers, approximately 18-20 meters tall, projected outwards. These towers were not merely defensive platforms, but miniature fortresses in themselves, often equipped with multiple levels, living quarters for soldiers, and ample provisions. They were designed to function independently if a section of the wall was breached, allowing defenders to continue resistance and harass the enemy from multiple angles. The upper levels of these towers were crenellated, providing further protection for the defenders, and the sheer height of the wall meant that scaling it was a Herculean task, even with siege ladders. The gates, too, were marvels of defensive engineering. There were multiple gates along the land walls, each a complex series of double or even triple arches, heavily fortified and often flanked by massive towers. The most famous of these, the Golden Gate Porta Aurea, was not just a utilitarian entrance, but a triumphal arch, richly adorned with sculptures and precious metals, used for imperial ceremonies. Its grandeur was a clear statement of Constantinople's power and divine favor, yet, beneath its glittering facade lay an impregnable defensive system. Designed to resist the most determined assaults, the gates were typically bottleneck points, where attackers would be funneled into a killing zone, exposed to fire from multiple directions. The effectiveness of these walls lay not just in their physical attributes, but in their psychological impact. For centuries, they stood as an unyielding barrier against a succession of formidable enemies. Huns under Attila, Avars, Slavs, Arabs, Bulgars, and Roses. Time and again, these invaders, despite their ferocity and numerical superiority, were forced to recoil from the Theodosian walls. The logistical nightmare of besieging such a city, with its vast food and water supplies, its well-organized defenses, and its access to the sea for resupply, often proved insurmountable. The walls didn't just deter, they exhausted and demoralized. Besieging armies would spend months, sometimes years, camped outside, their resources dwindling, their morale eroding, while the Byzantines, safe behind their formidable defenses, could patiently await reinforcements or the onset of disease and famine within the enemy ranks. The walls of Constantinople became synonymous with the city's very identity, a symbol of its resilience and its claim to be the new Rome, protected by God Himself. Yet, despite their seemingly invincible nature, did the Byzantines ever truly believe they were impenetrable? Or was there always a lurking fear of the one weakness, the one innovation that could bring them down? The Theodosian walls, while awe-inspiring in their construction, were not merely inert barriers of stone. Their true strength lay in the intricate interplay between the physical fortifications and the human element, the soldiers, engineers, and even the civilian population who maintained, manned, and adapted them over centuries. To truly appreciate the boring yet vital details of Constantinople's enduring defense, one must look beyond the static grandeur of the walls themselves and delve into the dynamic, ever-evolving strategies and technologies that kept them alive and unconquered for so long. The garrison of Constantinople was a professional force, though its size varied significantly throughout the empire's long history. At its peak, it could number in the tens of thousands, comprising various units, the elite tagmata stationed within the city, responsible for imperial defense and internal security, the numeri or ordinary infantry, and specialized units like the vigils, a kind of urban police and firefighting force, whose role in preventing internal fires during sieges was crucial. Life for these soldiers, even in peacetime, was rigorously disciplined. Training involved not just individual combat skills, but also intricate drills for manning the walls, practicing rapid deployment to threatened sectors, and coordinating defensive fire. Imagine the endless repetition of drawing bows, reloading ballistas, and maneuvering heavy siege engines onto the wall tops, a monotonous routine that, paradoxically, was the very bedrock of the city's survival. Their days would have been filled with patrols, inspections of the walls for structural weaknesses, and the constant readiness for drills or, worse, the sudden appearance of an enemy host on the horizon. Beyond the sheer numbers and training, the Byzantines excelled in the application of military technology. While often stereotyped as stagnant, the Byzantines were pragmatists, adopting and refining technologies that proved effective. The ballista, a large crossbow-like device capable of launching heavy bolts or stones with considerable force, was a staple of wall defense. More advanced were the onagers, a type of torsion catapult capable of hurling larger stones over significant distances, designed to disrupt enemy formations and destroy siege equipment. These machines required skilled crews to operate and maintain, and their deployment along the vast expanse of the walls was a carefully orchestrated affair, ensuring overlapping fields of fire and efficient resource allocation. Picture the massive timbers groaning under tension, the metallic clang of gears, and the thud of projectiles as these ancient engines of war were put through their paces. However, the most iconic and terrifying weapon in the Byzantine arsenal was Greek fire. The precise composition of this incendiary liquid remains one of history's enduring mysteries, a closely guarded state secret that was lost with the empire. What is known is that it was a petroleum-based substance, perhaps mixed with quicklime, sulfur, or resin, which ignited upon contact with water, making it devastatingly effective against wooden siege engines and, crucially, enemy ships. This wasn't merely a thrown incendiary. It was projected through bronze siphons, essentially flamethrowers, mounted on ships and, less commonly, on the walls themselves. Imagine the horror of an enemy fleet, packed tightly in the Golden Horn or the Sea of Marmara, suddenly engulfed in an unquenchable inferno, the water itself seeming to burn. The psychological effect of Greek fire was immense, often causing panic and rout among attackers who had never encountered such a weapon. Its impact on naval sieges of Constantinople, particularly during the Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries, was decisive. The sheer difficulty of extinguishing it, the toxic smoke, and the unholy sight of flames dancing on the water turned countless naval assaults into fiery nightmares for the attackers. But the land walls were only half the story. Constantinople was a peninsula, surrounded on three sides by water: the Golden Horn to the north, the Sea of Marmara to the south, and the narrow Bosporus Strait connecting them. The sea walls, though less imposing than their land counterparts, were equally vital. They typically consisted of a single, stout wall, often integrated with harbor defenses and watchtowers. The sheer length of these sea walls, stretching for many kilometers, presented its own defensive challenges. The Byzantines compensated for this by maintaining a powerful navy, The Byzantine navy was not merely a fleet of warships. It was a complex logistical and military organization. Its primary function was to control the seaways leading to Constantinople, ensuring resupply during sieges and preventing enemy fleets from bypassing the land defenses. The most crucial maritime defense, however, was the massive chain stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn. This monumental iron chain, composed of enormous links, could be raised and lowered by a mechanism housed in a fortified tower on the Galata side of the strait. When raised, it effectively sealed off the Golden Horn, turning it into a safe haven for the Byzantine fleet and preventing enemy ships from entering this crucial harbor. This chain, a simple yet incredibly effective piece of engineering, thwarted numerous naval assaults, most notably during the Rus's sieges in the 10th century. Imagine the immense effort required to forge, transport, and deploy such a chain, a testament to the empire's industrial capacity and its commitment to comprehensive defense. The daily life of a citizen within Constantinople during a siege was a stark contrast to the relative calm of peacetime. While soldiers manned the ramparts, civilians played an equally critical, though often overlooked, role. The city's vast granaries, supplied by agricultural produce from Thrace and Asia Minor, and its extensive network of cisterns fed by aqueducts, meant that Constantinople could withstand remarkably long sieges without succumbing to starvation or thirst. The Great Cistern Basilica. Cistern, a subterranean marvel supported by hundreds of columns, could hold enough water to sustain the city for months. Maintaining these logistical lifelines, repairing aqueducts under duress, and rationing supplies were tasks that fell largely to the civilian administration and often involved forced labor. Beyond logistics, the civilian population was frequently involved in repairs to the walls themselves. During active sieges, breaches caused by siege engines or mining operations would be frantically repaired by civilian work gangs, often women and children alongside men, under the direction of military engineers. These repairs might involve anything from filling gaps with rubble and timber to constructing temporary wooden palisades behind breaches. Their unwavering commitment to the city's survival, even in the face of imminent danger, speaks volumes about their connection to Constantinople and their understanding of the stakes involved. The psychological resilience of the populace, fostered by a deep religious conviction and a fierce loyalty to the imperial ideal, was as vital as any stone wall or war machine. They lived in a constant state of readiness, their lives punctuated by the ebb and flow of imperial stability and external threats. Their understanding of survival rooted in the city's ability to withstand repeated assaults. Yet, despite this formidable combination of physical and human defenses, the city would eventually fall. What subtle shifts in power, what internal decay, or what external innovation would eventually unravel centuries of impregnability? For centuries, the Theodosian walls stood as an unyielding bulwark, a symbol of Constantinople's defiance and the Byzantine Empire's enduring legacy. Time and again, they had proven their worth against overwhelming odds, earning the city the moniker Queen of Cities. Yet, no fortress, however formidable, can withstand the confluence of internal decay, technological innovation, and sheer, persistent pressure indefinitely. The story of Constantinople's eventual fall, therefore, is not a dramatic breaching of impregnable defenses by an unstoppable force, but a slow, agonizing unraveling, a testament to the fact that even the most robust fortifications are only as strong as the empire that maintains them. The first significant cracks in the seemingly unbreakable armor of Constantinople appeared not from external assault, but from within. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 CE represents a pivotal, almost unthinkable, betrayal. Western European crusaders, ostensibly on their way to the Holy Land, were diverted by Venetian machinations and eternal Byzantine dynastic squabbles. Instead of fighting infidels, they turned their crusading zeal and their formidable siege technology against the largest Christian city in the world. This was the first time the Theodosian walls were truly tested by a major, technologically advanced Western army, and the shocking outcome was not a direct military defeat in the traditional sense, but a collapse driven by internal political chaos and, crucially, a successful attack on the weaker sea walls. While the land walls held firm against the Crusaders, the Venetians, masters of naval warfare and siege engineering, focused their efforts on the poorly defended Golden Horn sea walls. Their ships, equipped with specially constructed siege towers, were able to approach the walls directly, and a combination of naval bombardment and a desperate, chaotic assault saw breaches made and the city eventually taken. The subsequent brutal sack of Constantinople, the establishment of the Latin Empire, and the systematic looting of the city's wealth and relics dealt a blow from which the Byzantine Empire, even after its restoration in 1261, never fully recovered. The walls themselves were damaged, and the manpower and resources to repair and maintain them to their former glory simply dwindled. This marked a profound shift. The myth of the wall's invincibility had been shattered, not by an external enemy focused solely on conquest, but by fellow Christians driven by greed and political ambition. The restored Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self, territorially diminished, economically enfeebled, and constantly beset by internal strife and external threats from all sides. The rising power of the Ottoman Turks in Anatolia, the Serbians, the Bulgarians, and the lingering animosity of Western powers, the once thriving population of Constantinople dwindled from over 1 million to perhaps less than 100,000 by the 15th century. This demographic collapse had a direct and devastating impact on the wall's maintenance and manning. Where once tens of thousands could be mustered for defense, now only a few thousand, a mixture of professional soldiers, foreign mercenaries, and armed citizens, were available to stretch thin across the vast expanse of the fortifications. Sections fell into disrepair, crucial maintenance was neglected, and the sheer number of defenders required to effectively man all 3 layers of the Theodosian system was simply unattainable. The city was slowly suffocating, its resources dwindling, its once vibrant heart beating ever more faintly. Then came the Ottoman threat, relentless and technologically advanced. The Ottoman Turks, unified under powerful sultans, had systematically conquered much of Anatolia and the Balkans, steadily encircling Constantinople. Their approach to siege warfare was characterized by immense numerical superiority, unwavering determination, and a willingness to embrace new technologies. The final, decisive assault came in 1453 under Sultan Mehmed II. Known as the Conqueror, Mehmed understood that the ancient walls, while still formidable against traditional siege methods, had a new, fatal weakness: gunpowder artillery. The 15th century had seen a revolution in siege warfare with the development of large, bronze cannons. While earlier cannons were often unreliable and slow to reload, by Mehmed's time, they had become instruments of terrifying destructive power. Mehmed commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to construct a gargantuan cannon, known as the Basilica or Great Bombard, capable of firing stone balls weighing hundreds of kilograms. This monstrous weapon, along with dozens of other large and medium-sized cannons, was hauled over immense distances, a logistical feat in itself, and positioned before the weakest section of the Theodosian walls, the Lycus Valley. This valley, where the small Lycus River flowed in under the walls, was considered the most vulnerable point because the ground here was lower, making the walls slightly less imposing and more susceptible to concentrated fire. The siege began on April 6th, 1453. For 53 days, the ancient walls, which had withstood so much, endured a relentless, unprecedented bombardment. The sheer concussive force of the cannonballs, each one capable of shattering large sections of masonry, slowly but inexorably began to tear open the legendary defenses. The Byzantines, under the courageous leadership of Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, fought with desperate heroism, repairing breaches at night with whatever materials they could find: timber, rubble, even furniture. Their repair efforts were remarkable, often constructing inner palisades to hold back the initial Ottoman assaults after a section of the outer wall had collapsed. They even managed to damage some of the Ottoman cannons with their own, smaller artillery and by making daring sorties. Yet, the sheer volume of Ottoman fire was overwhelming. When one section was repaired, another would be shattered. The Byzantines simply lacked the resources, manpower, and the equivalent artillery to counter the sustained bombardment. The final assault on May 29th, 1453, was a multi-pronged attack. While the main focus was on the breached section of the Lycus Valley, Ottoman forces also attacked other sections of the land walls, and the Ottoman navy, which Mehmed had ingeniously moved overland into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain, assaulted the sea walls. The battle raged for hours, a desperate, bloody struggle in the pre-dawn darkness. The Byzantine defenders, vastly outnumbered and exhausted, fought valiantly. The Lycus Valley breach was the critical point where successive waves of Ottoman irregulars, then professional troops, poured into the city. A small, often overlooked detail that contributed to the final collapse was the accidental leaving open of a minor postern gate. The Caricaporta, while its significance is debated by historians, it is believed that a small contingent of Ottoman soldiers managed to slip through this gate, causing panic and creating a diversion that further stretched the already beleaguered Byzantine lines. Emperor Constantine XI, true to his imperial oath, died fighting in the breach alongside his men, choosing death in battle over surrender. With his fall and the overwhelming numerical advantage of the Ottomans, the city's defenses finally collapsed. Constantinople, the enduring symbol of Roman power and Christian civilization, fell to the Ottoman Turks, becoming the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul. The fall of Constantinople was more than just the end of an empire. It was a watershed moment in history. It marked the definitive end of the Middle Ages for many historians, ushering in the early modern era. It demonstrated the devastating power of gunpowder artillery against traditional fortifications, rendering many medieval castles obsolete. It shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean and Europe, opening new avenues for trade and expansion for the Ottoman Empire. For the walls of Theodosius, it represented not a failure of engineering, but a testament to the fact that even the most brilliantly designed and resilient structures cannot withstand internal decline and radical technological shifts indefinitely. The city had outlasted countless empires, survived plagues and internal coups, but ultimately it could not survive the combination of its own slow decay and an enemy who had truly mastered the art of destruction. What enduring lessons can be drawn from the prolonged resilience and ultimate vulnerability of such a historically significant urban defense system, especially in an age where the nature of warfare has been so dramatically transformed? The Edict of Milan, from persecution to patronage, the mundane mechanisms of religious tolerance. Before we delve into the seemingly mundane, bureaucratic mechanisms that birthed religious tolerance in the Roman Empire, it's essential to understand the sheer, grinding reality of what it meant to be a Christian in the centuries leading up to the Edict of Milan in 313 CE. Forget, for a moment, the dramatic tales of martyrs facing lions in the arena. Those were the terrifying, if infrequent, climaxes to a much more pervasive and insidious form of persecution. For the vast majority of early Christians, their daily existence was characterized by a subtle yet constant tension with the dominant pagan society, punctuated by unpredictable waves of official, often brutal, imperial repression. Imagine yourself as a Christian artisan in, say, Antioch or Rome during the 2nd or 3rd century. Your life, on the surface, might appear normal. You run your workshop, conduct your business, raise your family, but beneath this veneer of normalcy lay a constant undercurrent of anxiety. The very act of living a Christian life in the Roman world was, by its nature, an act of quiet subversion against the deeply ingrained public religious practices of the state. Romans believed that the prosperity and stability of the empire were directly linked to the meticulous observance of the Pax Diorum, the peace of the gods. This meant participating in public sacrifices to the traditional Roman deities, acknowledging the divinity of the emperor, and generally conforming to the elaborate civic religious rituals that permeated every aspect of public life, from military service to local municipal governance. For a Christian, participation in these rituals was anathema. To burn incense before a statue of Jupiter, to swear an oath by the genius of the emperor, or to attend a public festival dedicated to a pagan god, was, for them, an act of idolatry, a betrayal of their singular god. This refusal was not seen by the Romans as a matter of personal piety, but as an act of disloyalty, an affront to the state, and potentially a cosmic threat to the empire's well-being. If the gods were angered by the Christians' obstinacy, who knew what calamities might befall Rome? Earthquakes, famines, military defeats, all could be attributed to the Christians' impious refusal to participate in the civic cult. So, while Christians were not always actively hunted, their nonconformity made them suspect. Social ostracism was a common consequence. Neighbors might eye them with suspicion, Whispers of strange rituals and cannibalistic practices, misinterpretations of the Eucharist could circulate, and accusations were always a possibility. A seemingly innocuous dispute with a neighbor could escalate into a charge of atheism, meaning atheism towards the Roman gods, or disloyalty, which could then bring the attention of local magistrates. These magistrates, often more concerned with maintaining public order and demonstrating their loyalty to the emperor than with theological disputes, would be obliged to investigate, and under Roman law, simply being a Christian was often enough to warrant punishment. There was no need to prove specific crimes. The very name Christianus was sufficient. The nature of persecution wasn't uniform. It varied wildly depending on the emperor, the region, and even the individual governor. Some periods saw localized, sporadic outbreaks, often fueled by public unrest or specific events like natural disasters. Others, however, were systematic and empire-wide. The Decian persecution in 250 CE, for instance, was particularly brutal because it mandated universal sacrifice. Every citizen was required to obtain a libellus, a certificate proving they had sacrificed to the Roman gods. Those who refused faced imprisonment, torture, confiscation of property, or even execution. Imagine the ethical dilemmas faced by ordinary Christians. Publicly denounce your faith to save your family from destitution, or stand firm and face certain punishment, leaving your loved ones vulnerable. This wasn't about grand gestures, it was about the mundane, agonizing choices that permeated daily life. The Great Persecution, initiated by Emperor Diocletian in 303 CE, was perhaps the most sustained and severe. It began with the destruction of churches and sacred texts, escalated to the imprisonment of clergy, and finally mandated universal sacrifice under pain of death. For nearly a decade, across vast swaths of the empire, Christians faced an existential threat. Their churches, often modest house churches or meeting halls, were razed, their scriptures burned, their leaders arrested and tortured. The goal was nothing less than the eradication of Christianity. Communities were shattered, families torn apart. Hiding became a necessity. Clandestine meetings in remote locations or private homes, the only way to worship. The fear of betrayal was omnipresent. A careless word, a suspicious neighbor, a zealous official, any could lead to your downfall. Yet, despite this relentless pressure, Christianity not only survived, but continued to grow. Its appeal lay in its inclusive message, its emphasis on community, charity, and hope, particularly for the marginalized and disenfranchised segments of Roman society. Slaves, women, and the poor found dignity and purpose within its nascent structures. The very steadfastness of martyrs, far from deterring others, often inspired them, demonstrating an unwavering faith that contrasted sharply with the often cynical and transactional nature of Roman paganism. The blood of the martyrs, as Tertullian famously declared, became the seed of the church. But how long could this clandestine, perilous existence endure? And what would it take for an empire built on centuries of polytheistic tradition to not just tolerate, but actively embrace a monotheistic faith it had once sought to extinguish? The transition from widespread, systemic persecution to official tolerance for Christianity was not a sudden epiphany on the part of the Roman emperors, but rather the culmination of complex political calculations, practical necessities, And in the case of Constantine, a profound personal conviction, the Edict of Milan, issued in 313 CE, often celebrated as a singular moment of religious freedom, was in fact a bureaucratic document, a pragmatic solution to a deeply entrenched problem, and the outcome of years of shifting imperial policies. To understand its true significance, we must examine the messy political chessboard of the Tetrarchy and the evolving realities that forced a change in imperial strategy. By the early 4th century, the Roman Empire was governed by a system known as the Tetrarchy, established by Diocletian. This system divided the vast empire into eastern and western halves, each ruled by an Augustus, supported by a Caesar, who was groomed as his successor while designed to stabilize the empire and improve administration. The Tetrarchy also created a volatile environment of competing ambitions. Diocletian, the senior Augustus, was a staunch traditionalist who believed that the resurgence of Roman traditional religion was vital for the empire's health. His great persecution, as we discussed, was an attempt to forcibly restore the Pax Deorum and unify the empire under a single, official religious framework. However, the persecution proved to be a costly failure. Despite its brutality, it did not eradicate Christianity. Instead, it created martyrs, fostered deeper Christian solidarity, and exposed the limitations of imperial power. The Christian community, though underground, was too widespread and resilient to be crushed. Furthermore, the persecution drained imperial resources, diverted administrative attention, and created widespread resentment. It became clear to some of the tetrarchs that the policy was simply not working. The first crack in the wall of persecution came from an unexpected source. Galerius, one of Diocletian's most ardent persecutors, as he lay dying from a painful illness in 311 CE, Galerius issued his own Edict of Toleration. This document, far less celebrated than the Edict of Milan, was a grudging admission of defeat. Galerius conceded that the persecution had failed to bring Christians back to traditional Roman religion, and that their stubborn adherence to their own cult was undeniable. Therefore, he declared, Christians would be permitted to exist and to hold their assemblies, provided they did nothing contrary to public order. In return, he asked them to pray for the well-being of the empire and for his own health. This was not an embrace of Christianity, but a weary concession, a pragmatic attempt to end a counterproductive policy. It revealed that the imperial administration was capable of shifting its stance when faced with the futility of its efforts. The stage was then set for Constantine. His rise to power was marked by a series of civil wars following the abdication of Diocletian and Maximian in the Western Roman Empire. Constantine found himself locked in a desperate struggle for control with Maxentius. The decisive moment came at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, just outside Rome. The traditional account, as recorded by Christian historians like Eusebius of Caesarea, states that Constantine experienced a divine vision on the eve of the battle. He saw a sign in the sky, either a cross or the Chi-Rho monogram, the first two Greek letters of Christ, and heard a voice commanding him to conquer in this sign. He ordered his soldiers to emblazon their shields with the Christian symbol. While the exact nature of Constantine's vision and his immediate conversion is a subject of historical debate, what is undeniable is the profound strategic and political impact of this moment. Constantine was a shrewd politician and a capable military leader. He recognized the growing strength of the Christian population, particularly in the Eastern Empire, and understood that their organized networks and moral cohesion could be a powerful asset, not a threat. By openly aligning himself with the Christian God, he tapped into a vast, disciplined, and resilient demographic that had been alienated by his rivals. This was a masterstroke of political acumen. He didn't just win a battle, he gained the potential loyalty of a significant portion of the empire's population. Following his victory over Maxentius, Constantine entered Rome as the undisputed ruler of the Western Empire. He immediately began to implement policies favorable to Christians. The Edict of Milan, issued jointly with Licinius, the Augustus of the East, in 313 CE, formalized this new approach. It was not, strictly speaking, an edict in the sense of a new law, but rather a letter or rescript outlining a common policy agreed upon by the two Augusti. Its language was crucial. It granted both to the Christians and to all others free faculty of following that religion which each man may wish. This was a revolutionary concept, explicit religious freedom for all, not just a grudging tolerance for Christians. The edict mandated several key provisions: the freedom of worship. Individuals were explicitly granted the right to choose and practice their religion without state interference. This included not just Christianity, but all other cults and beliefs. This universal freedom was a pragmatic move, ensuring no group felt alienated and avoiding further religious strife and restoration of property. Crucially, the edict decreed that all property confiscated from Christians during the persecution's churches, meeting places, and then other assets should be immediately restored to them, without compensation from the Christians to those who had acquired them. This was a significant practical step, enabling Christian communities to rebuild their infrastructure and operate openly. It also provided a clear legal framework for restitution, avoiding countless individual lawsuits and potential grievances. And official communication. The document itself was a formal communication distributed to provincial governors throughout the empire, ensuring that the new policy was understood and enforced at all levels of administration. This bureaucratic clarity was vital in ensuring that the spirit of the edict translated into practical reality on the ground. The Edict of Milan, therefore, was not merely a declaration of tolerance. It was a blueprint for a pragmatic shift in imperial policy. It acknowledged the failure of persecution, recognized the political utility of Christian support, and laid the groundwork for a new relationship between the Roman state and religious belief. It paved the way for Christians to move from the shadows into the mainstream, to openly construct churches, and to organize their communities without fear of reprisal. But this newfound freedom, while liberating, also presented its own set of challenges. How would the once persecuted church, now bathed in imperial favor, navigate the temptations of power and the complexities of becoming an established institution? And what unforeseen consequences would arise from the emperor's newfound interest in ecclesiastical affairs? The Edict of Milan marked a profound turning point for Christianity, transforming it from a persecuted minority faith into a favored religion of the Roman Empire. This shift, initiated by Constantine, was not merely a matter of stopping persecution. It was the active embrace of patronage, a process that had profound and often unexpectedly complicated consequences for both the church and the empire. The seemingly mundane details of this imperial favor, from tax exemptions to the financing of grand basilicas, reveal a complex relationship that forever altered the trajectory of Western civilization. Once toleration became official policy, Constantine wasted no time in extending tangible benefits to the Christian church. Bishops, once hunted and imprisoned, were now invited to imperial councils, consulted on legal matters, and given positions of honor. Christian clergy were granted exemptions from civic duties, including the often burdensome responsibility of serving on municipal councils, curiae, which had previously been a significant drain on their communities. This effectively elevated the clergy to a privileged class, similar to pagan priests, allowing them to dedicate themselves more fully to religious affairs without the distractions of secular obligations. Imagine the practical impact. A local priest, no longer burdened by tax collection or public works, could now focus entirely on ministering to his flock, leading to a more robust and organized church structure. Perhaps the most visible sign of imperial patronage was the unprecedented funding for church construction. Constantine embarked on an ambitious building program, commissioning magnificent basilicas in Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and other key cities. The Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, built over the traditional burial site of the apostle, was a massive undertaking, requiring immense resources and skilled labor. These weren't just modest meeting houses, they were monumental architectural statements designed to rival and even surpass the grandeur of pagan temples. The details of their construction, the sourcing of precious marbles, the logistics of transporting massive columns, the intricate mosaics and frescoes speak to the empire's vast wealth now being channeled into Christian worship. This state-sponsored architecture not only provided impressive spaces for liturgy, but also served as powerful symbols of Christianity's newfound legitimacy and prominence. For ordinary Christians who had worshipped in hidden rooms or modest structures, stepping into these grand basilicas must have been an awe-inspiring experience, a tangible manifestation of God's favor and the empire's new direction. Furthermore, the Edict of Milan indirectly facilitated the growth of the church's financial power, while properties confiscated during persecutions were restored. The edict also opened the door for wealthy converts to donate vast sums of land and resources to the church without fear of confiscation. The church, as a legal entity, could now inherit property and accumulate wealth. This rapidly growing financial base allowed it to expand its charitable activities, provide for the poor, and support its burgeoning clergy, further solidifying its position within society. The mundane details of property deeds, wills, and financial ledgers, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, were foundational to the church's institutional development. However, imperial patronage was a double-edged sword. With newfound imperial favor came imperial involvement. Constantine, as emperor, saw himself not only as a protector of the church, but also as its ultimate arbiter. He viewed unity within the Christian faith as essential for the stability of the empire. This led him to intervene directly in theological disputes, most notably the Arian controversy, which centered on the nature of Christ. To resolve this divisive theological debate, Constantine convened the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. The Council of Nicaea was a watershed moment, illustrating the new dynamic between church and state. Bishops from across the empire, many of whom still bore the scars of persecution, traveled at imperial expense to attend. Constantine himself presided over some of the sessions, actively participating in the discussions and pushing for a unified creed. His presence lent imperial authority to the proceedings, and his desire for consensus was palpable. While the council ultimately produced the Nicene Creed, a foundational statement of Christian doctrine, it also established a dangerous precedent that the emperor had a legitimate role in defining Christian orthodoxy. This blurred the lines between temporal and spiritual authority, laying the groundwork for centuries of complex, often contentious, relationships between emperors and patriarchs, kings and popes. The immediate aftermath of Nicaea also revealed the coercive potential of imperial involvement. Bishops who refused to sign the Nicene Creed faced exile. This was no longer just about theological disagreement, it was about imperial decree. The state, having offered protection and patronage, now demanded conformity. This marked a departure from the freedom of religion ostensibly granted by the Edict of Milan. While individuals could theoretically choose their faith, the state's preference for a particular theological interpretation meant that dissenting Christian groups would face increasing pressure and, eventually, renewed forms of persecution, albeit from a Christianized state rather than a pagan one. Moreover, the influx of new converts, attracted by imperial favor and the social benefits of aligning with the now dominant religion, led to a phenomenon known as mass conversions. While outwardly expanding the church's numbers, this often meant a dilution of the fervent personal commitment that characterized earlier Christian communities. Many entered the church for pragmatic reasons, bringing with them lingering pagan practices and beliefs, which gradually blurred the distinctiveness of Christian identity. The rigorous discipline and intense spiritual life of the early, persecuted church began to soften, replaced by a more relaxed, mainstream adherence. The Edict of Milan, therefore, was not simply a declaration of religious freedom, but the opening act in a long, intricate drama of power, faith, and unintended consequences. It laid the foundation for a Christian empire, but it also sowed the seeds of future conflicts between spiritual and temporal authority. It transformed the church into a powerful, wealthy institution, but it also exposed it to the temptations of worldly power and political compromise. The once radical notion of religious tolerance, born of pragmatic necessity, had evolved into a system where state and church were inextricably linked, a relationship that would define the next 1,000 years of European history. How did this new dynamic, ushered in by a simple bureaucratic letter, permanently alter the very nature of religious belief and its role in human governance, setting a precedent that echoes even in our modern understanding of church and state? The Emperor Justinian's quest for order, codifying chaos in the Roman law. To truly grasp the monumental and, in many ways, profoundly tedious undertaking that was Emperor Justinian I's codification of Roman law, one must first appreciate the utterly chaotic and unwieldy state of the legal system that preceded him. Imagine, if you will, being a citizen of the Roman Empire in the early 6th century, needing to resolve a property dispute, claim an inheritance, or defend yourself against an accusation, your legal journey would not involve a single, clear set of statutes, but a bewildering, often contradictory, labyrinth of legal sources that stretched back over 1,000 years. This wasn't just complex, it was an active impediment to justice, a breeding ground for corruption, and a bureaucratic nightmare that stifled efficient governance. The Roman legal tradition was, paradoxically, its greatest strength and its most significant weakness. From the 12 tables in the 5th century BCE, the foundational written laws of Rome, through centuries of senatorial decrees, popular assemblies' enactments, imperial edicts, and the voluminous writings of legal scholars, the body of Roman law had grown organically, haphazardly, and without any central mechanism for systematic organization or reconciliation. By Justinian's time, the sheer quantity of legal material was staggering. There were thousands upon thousands of individual laws, judicial rulings, and legal commentaries, often spread across countless scrolls and parchment codices, many of which were contradictory, obsolete, or simply inaccessible. Consider the role of the iuris consulti legal experts or jurists. These were not simply lawyers in the modern sense. They were scholars who interpreted the law, wrote treatises, and offered opinions responsa on specific legal questions. Their opinions, over time, acquired a binding force, effectively becoming law themselves, while brilliant minds like Ulpian, Papinian, and Gaius produced profound legal thought. Their works, often running to dozens of volumes, were not systematically organized. Different jurists might hold opposing views on the same legal principle, creating confusion and uncertainty. A legal dispute could hinge entirely on which jurist's opinion a judge chose to prioritize, or, worse, on the judge's ability to even find the relevant opinion amidst the mountainous legal literature. Imagine a judge, with no centralized legal library or search engine, having to wade through countless obscure texts, trying to reconcile conflicting precedents from centuries apart. This was the daily reality of administering justice. Furthermore, imperial pronouncements added another layer of complexity. Each emperor, from Augustus onward, issued a multitude of edicts, decrees, rescripts responses to legal queries, and mandates. These imperial laws, constitutiones, accumulated over centuries, often without proper indexing or annulment of outdated provisions. A new imperial decree might implicitly or explicitly contradict an older one, leading to legal ambiguity and endless opportunities for legal hair splitting. Lawyers and judges spent countless hours simply trying to ascertain which law was currently in force, or which imperial rescript applied to a specific case, a task made even more difficult by the lack of a comprehensive, updated compilation. The practical implications for ordinary citizens were dire. Justice was slow, expensive, and unpredictable. A simple lawsuit could drag on for years, as lawyers argued over which legal source was authoritative, or how to interpret a vague passage from a 3rd century jurist. The cost of legal advice was exorbitant, as only the wealthiest could afford to employ scholars who had mastered the labyrinthine legal texts. This created a system ripe for abuse, where the cunning or well-connected could exploit the legal complexities to their advantage, while the less fortunate were often denied justice. Corruption thrived in this environment, as the sheer opacity of the legal system made it easy for judges or officials to manipulate outcomes. Citing obscure precedents or deliberately misinterpreting ambiguous texts beyond individual cases, the chaotic state of the law hindered effective governance. The emperor's ability to issue new laws or reform existing ones was hampered by the fear of creating further contradictions or inadvertently overturning established beneficial principles. Provincial governors struggled to administer justice uniformly across the vast empire, as different regions might prioritize different legal interpretations or possess different collections of legal texts. The very unity of the Roman state, which relied on a common legal framework, was threatened by this creeping legal anarchy. It was a system that functioned not because of its clarity, but despite its inherent dysfunction, held together primarily by the sheer inertia of tradition and the desperate attempts of individual jurists and judges to make sense of the mess. The Roman Empire, despite its legendary administrative prowess, had allowed its most fundamental institution, its law, to become a Gordian knot of unparalleled complexity. How, then, could one ambitious emperor hope to untangle such an ancient and entrenched legal chaos? And what singular vision would drive him to embark on such an unprecedented undertaking? The chaos of Roman law before Justinian was not merely an inconvenience. It was a systemic problem threatening the very fabric of the empire. Emperor Justinian, who ascended the throne of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire in 527 CE, was a man of immense ambition, driven by a profound desire to restore the glory of the Roman Empire. His vision was multifaceted: to reconquer lost Western territories, to unify the Christian Church, and, crucially, to bring order to the sprawling, contradictory mass of Roman law. It was this last ambition, arguably the most enduring of his legacies, that required a meticulous, painstaking, and an often excruciatingly boring bureaucratic effort, masterminded by his brilliant but controversial legal minister, Tribonian. Justinian understood that a revitalized empire needed a clear, consistent, and accessible legal framework. Justice, he believed, was the foundation of good governance, and without clarity in the law, justice could not be reliably dispensed. His aim was nothing less than to compile, organize, and rationalize a millennium of Roman legal thought, creating a single, authoritative body of law that would eliminate contradictions, discard obsolete statutes, and provide a definitive reference for all future legal proceedings. This was not a mere compilation. It was an act of profound intellectual and administrative reorganization, a project of a scale almost unimaginable for its time. The first step in this colossal undertaking began almost immediately after Justinian's accession. In 528 CE, he appointed a commission to compile all existing imperial constitutions laws issued by emperors into a new codex code. This initial Codex Iustinianus was completed remarkably quickly, by 529 CE, and superseded all previous imperial collections. This was merely the appetizer. However, for the main course of Justinian's legal reforms, the true challenge lay in the Ius Vetus, the Old Law, comprising the vast body of juristic writings and senatorial decrees. This was the labyrinth of conflicting opinions and obscure interpretations that had paralyzed the legal system. For this monumental task, Justinian turned to Tribonian. Tribonian was a highly educated jurist fluent in both Latin and Greek, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Roman law. He was, however, also known for his avarice and a reputation for bending the rules, which made him a controversial figure. Despite these personal failings, his intellectual capacity and tireless work ethic were precisely what the project demanded. In 530 CE, Justinian issued a decree appointing Tribonian to head a commission with the seemingly impossible mandate to sift through the entire mass of existing juristic literature, extract what was still valuable and relevant, reconcile contradictions, remove repetitions, and organize it into a coherent, systematic collection. This was to become the Digesta Digest, or Pandecte Pandex, a massive compendium of legal opinions. The commission, consisting of Tribonian, 17 other jurists and professors of law, and a large support staff of scribes, embarked on a task that historians marvel at to this day. Imagine the sheer scale of the documents they had to process. The juristic writings alone amounted to an estimated 3 million lines of text, contained in over 2,000 books. This was a physical challenge of immense proportion. The commission members, working diligently for 3 years, had to read, analyze, compare, excerpt, and categorize this enormous volume of material. Their daily routine would have been characterized by long hours of meticulous reading, intense scholarly debate, and the painstaking process of cross-referencing and annotating countless texts. The dust of ancient scrolls, the smell of parchment, and the endless scratching of pens would have filled their workspace in Constantinople. The process involved several key steps. The selection. The commissioners had to decide which juristic opinions were authoritative and still applicable. They were given the power to alter the original text's interpolation, to resolve contradictions, or to modernize language. A controversial but necessary power given the goal of consistency. Organization. The selected excerpts were then organized by subject matter into 50 books, each divided into titles and then further into individual laws or fragments. This systematic arrangement was revolutionary, allowing for far easier navigation and retrieval of legal information than ever before. On harmonization, the most difficult aspect was resolving the countless discrepancies and contradictions that had accumulated over centuries. This required deep legal insight and careful judgment, as the Commission effectively made legislative decisions about what the law should be, rather than simply documenting what it had been. The Digesta was completed with astonishing speed. Promulgated in 533 CE, it was a monumental achievement, condensing 1,000 years of legal scholarship into a relatively manageable 50 volumes. Justinian declared it to be the sole source of juristic law. All previous juristic writings were to be discarded and no longer cited in court. This was a radical move, designed to eliminate the very source of the legal chaos that had plagued the empire. Simultaneously with the work on the Digesta, the Commission also produced the Institutiones Institutes, a textbook designed for law students. This was an elementary treatise, drawing heavily from Gaius's earlier institutes, intended to provide a systematic introduction to Roman law, making it more accessible to those entering the legal profession. Its creation underscored Justinian's commitment not just to codifying the law, but also to ensuring its proper understanding and transmission to future generations. Finally, as new laws continued to be issued by Justinian himself. A revised and updated version of the Codex Iustinianus was published in 534 CE, incorporating the new legislation and integrating it with the earlier imperial decrees. This second edition became the definitive collection of imperial legislation, collectively the Codex, Digesta, and Institutiones, along with the Novellae e Constitutiones, new constitutions, which were Justinian's later laws issued after 534 CE, form what eventually came to be known as the Corpus Juris Civilis body of civil law. This was not a name given by Justinian himself, but by later scholars. His immediate goal was simpler: to provide a clear, coherent, and universal legal system for his empire. The success of this endeavor was profound, laying the intellectual groundwork for centuries of legal scholarship and administration. Yet, for all its meticulous organization and enduring impact, did Justinian's ambitious legal project truly resolve all ambiguity, or did it merely impose a new, albeit orderly, set of limitations on the dynamic nature of law and justice? The completion of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis was a triumph of administrative will and intellectual labor, a project that, for all its bureaucratic tedium, profoundly shaped the course of legal history. However, its immediate reception and its long-term impact were far from straightforward. While it aimed to bring clarity and uniformity to the Roman Empire, its true influence would resonate centuries later across continents, demonstrating how the meticulous work of a few dedicated scholars under an ambitious emperor could lay the foundational stones for entirely new legal systems. In the Eastern Roman Empire, the Corpus Juris Civilis was immediately implemented as the supreme law of the land. It streamlined judicial processes, made legal education more efficient, and provided a coherent framework for imperial administration. Judges and lawyers no longer had to navigate a chaotic sea of conflicting texts. They had a single, authoritative reference. This drastically reduced the opportunities for legal quibbles based on obscure or outdated precedents, theoretically leading to swifter and more consistent justice. For the bureaucracy of the Byzantine Empire, it was a godsend, allowing for more efficient governance and clearer legal principles to be applied across its diverse provinces. The details of provincial administration, tax collection, and military law all benefited from this newfound clarity. Imperial decrees could now be integrated into a stable, well-defined legal framework, rather than simply adding to the existing confusion. However, even within the Byzantine Empire, the Corpus Juris Civilis was not static. The sheer volume and complexity of the Digesta, in particular, meant that many ordinary judges and lawyers struggled to master it fully. Over time, simplified summaries and commentaries were produced to make it more accessible. Furthermore, Justinian himself continued to issue new laws, the Novellae Constitutiones, which, while collected, were never formally integrated into a single, comprehensive third edition of the Code during his reign. This meant that the legal system continued to evolve, albeit within the framework established by the corpus. Later Byzantine emperors and legal scholars would continue to amend, interpret, and adapt the law to suit the changing needs of the empire, eventually leading to further compilations and epitomes, such as the Basilica in the 9th century. This demonstrated that even a comprehensive codification could not fully freeze the dynamic nature of law in a living society. The true, unexpected legacy of Justinian's work, however, lay not in its continuous application in the East, but in its eventual rediscovery and profound influence in the West. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, knowledge of Roman law fragmented, while some residual Roman legal principles persisted in various barbarian kingdoms. The detailed complexities of the corpus juris civilis largely faded from common use. The original Latin texts were either lost, forgotten, or simply too dense for the nascent legal systems of early medieval Europe. Then, in the 11th century, a copy of the Digesta, specifically the Littera Florentina, a nearly complete manuscript, was rediscovered in Italy. This rediscovery, particularly at the University of Bologna, sparked a legal revolution. Scholars, known as the glossators, meticulously studied, interpreted, and commented upon the Roman texts. They added glosses, explanatory notes between the lines and in the margins of the manuscripts, trying to decipher the intricacies of the Roman legal mind. This painstaking academic work, initially confined to university classrooms, slowly began to filter into the practical legal systems of Europe. The impact was transformative. Medieval Europe was characterized by a patchwork of customary laws, feudal obligations, and local statutes, often inconsistent and incomplete. The Roman law, as embodied in the corpus juris civilis, offered a coherent, rational, and systematic framework for justice. It provided sophisticated concepts of contract, property, obligations, and state power that were far more advanced than anything then existing in the West. Jurists trained in Roman law began to advise rulers, staff chanceries, and sit on judicial benches, slowly but surely infusing Roman legal principles into the emerging national legal systems. This reception of Roman law was not uniform across Europe. In some regions, like Germany, it had a profound and direct influence, forming the basis of their legal systems for centuries. In others, like England, it influenced legal thought in specific areas like admiralty and ecclesiastical law, but the common law tradition remained dominant. Nevertheless, the intellectual framework provided by Justinian's codification became the bedrock of modern civil law traditions that prevail in much of Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia and Africa today. Concepts such as judicial precedent, legal personality, and detailed contractual agreements, which seem self-evident to us, found their systematic articulation in the corpus juris civilis. The meticulous efforts of Tribonian and his commission, and the imperial ambition of Justinian, ultimately produced a legal masterpiece that transcended its immediate purpose. It wasn't just about bringing order to the Byzantine Empire. It was about preserving a monumental intellectual heritage that would later serve as the blueprint for the legal structures of entirely new civilizations. The boring details of legal compilation, the cross-referencing, the selection, the harmonization of texts proved to be the fertile ground from which much of modern jurisprudence would grow. The legal legacy of ancient Rome, distilled and preserved by a Byzantine emperor, became the silent architect of legal systems across the globe, enduring far longer than the empire that created it. What does this long journey of legal texts, from forgotten scrolls to global influence, tell us about the unexpected ways in which the detailed and meticulous work of one era can profoundly shape the distant future, often in ways unimaginable to its original creators. The unseen hands of stability. Daily life in the Byzantine countryside. While Constantinople gleamed as the undisputed metropolis of the medieval world, a beacon of trade, culture, and imperial power, the vast majority of the Byzantine Empire's population lived far from its golden walls, rooted deeply in the soil of its sprawling countryside. Their lives, though seemingly monotonous and often brutal by modern standards, were the silent, unseen engine that sustained the empire for over 1,000 years. To understand Byzantine resilience, one must look beyond the imperial court and delve into the mundane, yet profoundly significant, rhythms of rural survival. Imagine, if you will, a small village nestled in the fertile plains of Anatolia or the rugged hills of Greece in the 8th or 9th century. Your day, as a Byzantine peasant or Georgos, would begin before dawn, often with the crow of a rooster or the first faint light of the sun. There was no leisure, no concept of a weekend as we know it. Survival was a constant, demanding endeavor, dictated by the relentless cycle of the seasons and the needs of the land. The Byzantine countryside was predominantly agrarian, and agriculture was the backbone of the empire's economy. The primary crops were cereals, wheat, barley, and millet, which formed the staple diet. Cultivation methods were largely traditional, relying on animal power, oxen, or donkeys. Simple wooden plows and manual labor. Fields were often small, fragmented plots, sometimes owned by individual families, sometimes leased from larger landowners, including wealthy aristocrats, monasteries, or the imperial domain. The details of tenancy agreements, often involving shares of the harvest or labor services, were complex and varied by region, but they all ultimately translated into a significant portion of the peasant's labor being dedicated to someone else. Your workday would involve arduous physical labor, plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting. In spring, the air would be filled with the dust of freshly turned earth and the scent of newly planted seeds. Summer brought the relentless heat and the crucial task of weeding, a back-breaking effort to protect the nascent crops. Autumn was the most critical period, the harvest. Every able-bodied person, from young children to the elderly, would be involved. The success of the harvest meant the difference between survival and starvation for the coming year, and the village would collectively breathe a sigh of relief when the granaries were finally filled. Beyond the fields, daily life involved a myriad of other tasks. There was the constant need for water, often fetched from a communal well or spring. Firewood had to be collected from nearby forests for cooking and heating, a laborious chore that sustained the household through the cold winter months. Animals, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens needed tending, providing milk, cheese, meat a rarity for most, wool, and eggs. Women played an indispensable role, not only assisting in the fields, but also managing the household, grinding grain into flour, often using a hand quern, a tedious process, baking bread, spinning wool, weaving cloth, making clothes, and preparing meals. Their days were equally, if not more, demanding than those of the men. A constant juggle of domestic duties and agricultural labor. Housing in the Byzantine countryside was modest and functional. Peasant homes were typically single-story structures built from local materials, mud brick, stone, or timber with thatched or tiled roofs. They were often small, consisting of one or two rooms shared by the family and sometimes even their smaller livestock during harsh winters for warmth. Furnishings were sparse, simple wooden benches, a rough table, sleeping mats or straw mattresses. Life was communal and lacked privacy by modern standards. The village was the primary unit of social organization, where families were interconnected by kinship, marriage, and shared labor cooperation, particularly during peak agricultural seasons, was essential for survival. The looming presence of the state was felt most keenly through taxation. The Byzantine Empire, for all its sophistication, relied heavily on agricultural output for its revenue. Peasants paid taxes in kind, a portion of their harvest, or in coin, and often both. Imperial officials, the comerciarioi tax collectors, would periodically visit the villages, meticulously assessing crops and livestock. The burden of taxation was constant and often severe, especially in times of war or famine. This financial pressure forced many peasants into cycles of debt, sometimes leading them to forfeit their small plots of land to wealthier landowners or the church, becoming paroikoi dependent tenants who were tied to the land they cultivated. Effectively serfs, while not chattel slaves, their mobility was severely restricted, and they owed a portion of their labor or produce to their landlords. Beyond the economic burdens, rural life was fraught with insecurity. Brigandage was a persistent threat, especially in remote or border regions. Raids by hostile neighbors, Slavs, Arabs, Bulgars could sweep through a village, destroying crops, plundering homes, and carrying off inhabitants into slavery. The imperial army, while a source of protection, was also a source of conscription, taking young men away from their families and fields, further straining village resources. Disease, too, was a constant companion. A bad harvest followed by a harsh winter could lead to famine, and epidemics could decimate entire communities with terrifying speed, leaving behind a profound sense of helplessness. Despite these hardships, the Byzantine countryside was also a place of deep-rooted traditions and quiet resilience. Religious faith, centered around the village church and its priest, provided solace and community. Local saints' days, seasonal festivals, and the rhythm of the Orthodox liturgy provided structure and meaning to lives often dominated by hard labor. This enduring connection to the land and the steadfastness of the rural population were crucial, providing the manpower and sustenance that allowed the Byzantine Empire to weather countless storms. Even as its grand imperial ventures played out on a larger stage. But what intricate network of trade, bureaucracy, and subtle imperial intervention allowed these disparate, often isolated, rural communities to remain connected to the distant capital and contribute to the empire's overarching survival. The seeming isolation of the Byzantine countryside might suggest a collection of self-sufficient, disconnected communities. However, the survival and longevity of the Byzantine Empire depended precisely on its ability to integrate these myriad rural elements into a coherent, functioning whole. This was achieved through a subtle yet pervasive imperial reach that manifested through administrative structures, trade networks, and the vital role of the church, all of which facilitated the flow of resources, information, and people between the periphery and the distant imperial center in Constantinople. The most direct link between the imperial government and the rural population was the provincial administration. By the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire had largely transitioned to the theme system, a military administrative division that organized provinces under the command of a strategos, a military governor who wielded both military and civil authority. This system was a pragmatic response to constant external threats, aiming to decentralize defense and create a more responsive local military. However, it also served as the primary conduit for imperial control and taxation. Imagine the strategos or his appointed officials traveling through the theme, conducting censuses, assessing land for taxes, and conscripting men for military service. These were not abstract figures in Constantinople. They were tangible representatives of imperial power, capable of issuing orders, resolving disputes, and enforcing laws. The annual tax collection was a crucial interaction. The Byzantine state, renowned for its meticulous bureaucracy, maintained elaborate land registers practica that detailed property ownership, land use, and tax assessments down to the individual household. This allowed for surprisingly accurate and consistent taxation, ensuring a steady flow of agricultural produce and coin to the imperial treasury, which in turn funded the army, the bureaucracy, and the splendor of the capital. For the peasant, this often meant a significant portion of their harvest, sometimes as much as a third or even half in difficult years, was destined for imperial storehouses or the markets where the state purchased goods. Beyond direct administration, trade played a crucial, if often understated, role in connecting rural communities. While peasants primarily produced for subsistence, they also engaged in local markets to acquire goods they couldn't produce themselves, such as salt, iron tools, or pottery. These local markets were linked to regional trade routes, which in turn fed into the empire's extensive internal and external commercial networks. Produce from the fertile plains of Anatolia might be shipped to Constantinople, while wine from Thrace or olive oil from Greece could find its way to distant towns. The state often regulated these markets, establishing weights and measures, inspecting goods, and collecting customs duties, further integrating the rural economy into the imperial system. The passage of merchants and their goods, even at a humble local level, also served as conduits for news, imperial decrees, and cultural influences, subtly eroding the isolation of the countryside. The church was another powerful unifying force. Every village, no matter how small, typically had a church and a priest. The priest, often drawn from the local community, served not only as a spiritual guide, but also as a vital link to the broader imperial structure. He delivered sermons that reinforced imperial authority, often linking the emperor's well-being to divine favor, acted as a local arbiter of disputes and recorded births, deaths, and marriages, providing a rudimentary form of census data to imperial officials. Monasteries, too, were significant landowners and economic centers in the countryside. They provided employment, charitable relief, and spiritual guidance, often acting as anchors of stability and learning in remote regions. The annual rhythm of Christian festivals observed throughout the empire further knit together diverse communities, creating a shared cultural and religious identity that transcended local dialects and customs. Moreover, the Byzantine imperial postal service, though primarily for official communication, occasionally facilitated the movement of goods or important individuals. Roads, though not always well maintained, still existed as arteries connecting towns and villages. Imperial couriers, soldiers, and tax collectors constantly traversed these routes, embodying the reach of central authority. Beyond these formal structures, the system also relied on local adaptations and a degree of peasant self organization. Villages often had their own elders or local councils that managed communal resources, such as irrigation systems or common pastures. They would collectively decide on planting schedules, negotiate with landlords, and represent the community in dealings with imperial officials. This blend of imperial oversight and local autonomy allowed for a flexible system that could adapt to varying regional conditions and maintain a degree of popular acceptance, or at least resignation. The resilience of the Byzantine countryside, therefore, wasn't just about individual hardiness. It was about the intricate, often unglamorous, administrative and economic mechanisms that bound disparate communities to the imperial center. It was a constant balancing act between extracting resources necessary for imperial survival and ensuring the basic livelihood of the rural population. When this balance was disturbed by excessive taxation, military defeats, or natural disasters, the consequences could be dire, leading to peasant revolts, rural depopulation, and a weakening of the empire's foundations. The health of the empire, from its grandest basilicas to its mightiest armies, ultimately rested on the steady flow of grain, olives, and labor from these countless, often unseen, rural communities. What happens when this delicate balance is shattered, and the very foundation of the empire's long-term survival is put to the test by external pressure and internal unrest? Pushing the limits of resilience, the Byzantine countryside, for all its structural integration and resilience, was far from immune to the profound shocks that repeatedly assailed the empire. Plagues, invasions, civil wars, and economic downturns were not abstract concepts discussed in the imperial palace. They were existential threats that directly impacted the daily survival of every peasant household. The story of the Byzantine rural population is therefore also one of constant adaptation, of enduring unimaginable hardship, and of the quiet, dogged determination that allowed life to persist, even when the grand narratives of imperial power faltered. One of the most devastating blows to the Byzantine countryside was the Justinianic plague, which first struck in 541 to 542 CE and recurred intermittently for the next 2 centuries. This pandemic, a forerunner of the Black Death, decimated the population across the Mediterranean world, including the heartlands of the Byzantine Empire. Imagine the immediate horror: entire villages wiped out, fields left untended, families shattered. The impact on rural life was catastrophic. Labor shortages became acute, leading to widespread agricultural decline. Land lay fallow, crops rotted, and the delicate balance between peasant labor and imperial demand was violently disrupted. Taxes could not be collected from the dead, and the remaining population, often weakened and demoralized, struggled to maintain production. This demographic collapse profoundly reshaped the landscape, leading to the abandonment of some settlements and a shift in land ownership as large estates struggled to find enough laborers. Following the plague, The empire faced a series of relentless invasions, particularly from the Persians and later the Arabs in the 7th century. These conflicts often swept through fertile agricultural regions, turning productive land into battlegrounds. Raids meant the burning of crops, the looting of granaries, and the systematic abduction of people into slavery. For a peasant community, a successful raid could mean utter ruin, the loss of their annual harvest, the destruction of their homes, and the disappearance of family members. Survival often meant fleeing to fortified towns, hiding in remote wilderness, or seeking refuge in monasteries, only to return to a devastated landscape. These periods of intense insecurity forced communities to become more self-reliant and adaptable, developing local defense mechanisms or seeking protection from powerful local landlords who could offer some semblance of security. The Arab conquests, in particular, led to the permanent loss of vast, wealthy agricultural territories, especially Egypt and Syria, which had historically been the breadbaskets of the empire. This loss forced the remaining Byzantine heartlands, particularly Anatolia and the Balkans, to become even more vital sources of food and revenue. The burden on the surviving rural population intensified, as they were now responsible for sustaining an empire with significantly reduced resources. This pressure, combined with ongoing warfare, contributed to the evolution of the theme system, making rural communities more directly tied to military service and local defense. Peasants might find themselves serving as part-time soldiers, defending their own lands, blurring the lines between farmer and warrior. Despite these immense pressures, the Byzantine countryside displayed remarkable resilience. Communities found ways to adapt. Agricultural practices, while traditional, were often efficient for their context, including irrigation systems, terracing in hilly areas, and crop rotation to maintain soil fertility. The deep-rooted knowledge of local ecosystems and agricultural cycles allowed communities to rebound, even after devastating events, provided they had enough surviving members. The extended family and communal bonds within villages were crucial for recovery, providing mutual aid and labor during rebuilding efforts. Furthermore, the influence of monasteries often played a stabilizing role. Monasteries, with their large landholdings and disciplined labor forces, could often weather economic downturns better than individual peasants. They provided refuge, redistributed charity, and sometimes even pioneered new agricultural techniques. Their presence could also attract settlers to depopulated areas, as they offered a degree of protection and economic opportunity. The enduring capacity of the Byzantine state to reorganize and extract resources, even from a diminished and struggling countryside, also contributed to overall imperial survival. While often burdensome, the tax system and administrative structures ensured that essential supplies reached the army and the capital. The central government, through its komerkiarioi and strategoi, continued to demand and collect, forcing communities to produce even in dire circumstances. This tenacious insistence on maintaining state functions, even when the well ran dry, was a testament to the Byzantine bureaucratic mindset, a dry, persistent will that contributed to the empire's extraordinary longevity. Ultimately, the survival of the Byzantine Empire was not just about emperors, generals, or theological debates. It was fundamentally about the anonymous peasant, quietly tilling the soil, enduring hardship, and maintaining the basic economic engine of the state. Their daily struggle for subsistence, their willingness to rebuild after devastation, and their steadfast contribution to the imperial tax base were the unseen pillars upon which the empire's long life rested. They were the silent majority whose persistent endurance shaped the very continuity of the Byzantine state. Their story highlights the profound truth that the grand narratives of empires are often built upon the incredibly detailed, laborious, and often unglamorous lives of ordinary people. What do these silent histories, these stories of persistent survival against overwhelming odds, tell us about the fundamental, often overlooked, sources of resilience in human civilization? Even in the face of forces seemingly bent on utter destruction, the iconoclast controversy, unseen battles over sacred images. For centuries, the visual arts had played a central and revered role in Christian worship. Particularly in the Eastern Roman Empire, icons painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, saints, and biblical scenes were not merely decorative. They were understood as windows to the divine, venerated as sacred objects that facilitated prayer and connection with the spiritual realm. Churches were adorned with them, homes displayed them, and soldiers carried them into battle. Yet, in the early 8th century, a profound theological and political storm erupted that would shake the Byzantine Empire to its core for over 100 years. The iconoclast controversy. This wasn't a battle fought with swords, but with theological treatises, imperial decrees, and, ultimately, the subtle but devastating power of public opinion, revealing how deeply ingrained beliefs about the sacred could ignite a society-wide conflict over seemingly mundane objects. The genesis of iconoclasm, the movement to destroy icons, is complex and multifaceted, with roots in various intellectual, religious, and political currents. One major contributing factor was the growing influence of monotheistic religions, particularly Islam, on the Byzantine Empire's borders. Islam, strictly anti-idolatry, viewed any depiction of God or prophets as blasphemous. As the Byzantines found themselves in constant military conflict with the expanding Arab Caliphate, some emperors and theologians began to question whether their veneration of images might be provoking divine displeasure and contributing to military defeats. Was God punishing them for what could be perceived as idolatry? However, the primary intellectual and theological impetus came from within the Christian tradition itself, specifically from a renewed focus on the Mosaic Law's prohibition against graven images. Exodus 20:4-5. You shall not make for yourself a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. While earlier Christian theology had largely reconciled this prohibition with the use of sacred images through careful distinctions between veneration, proskynesis, and worship latreia, the iconoclasts argued that the line had been blurred, and that ordinary people were indeed slipping into idolatry, worshipping the image itself rather than the prototype it represented. The controversy truly ignited with Emperor Leo III. The Isaurian reigned 717-741 CE. Leo, a highly capable military commander and administrator who had saved Constantinople from a major Arab siege, was convinced that the empire's misfortunes were divine punishment for what he perceived as widespread idolatry. He was also likely influenced by his origins in the eastern provinces of the empire, where aniconic traditions, those against images, were perhaps stronger, and where direct exposure to Islamic and Jewish traditions of strict monotheism was more prevalent. His initial actions were cautious but firm. In 726 CE, he issued an edict ordering the removal of a prominent icon of Christ from the Chaka Gate, the ceremonial entrance to the Great Palace in Constantinople. This act, seemingly small, sparked immediate and violent protests from the populace, particularly women, who were deeply attached to their icons. This popular resistance clearly demonstrated how deeply ingrained icon veneration was in daily Byzantine piety. The imperial authorities, however, pressed on. Further decrees followed, eventually culminating in a ban on the veneration of all icons and the beginning of their systematic destruction. Imagine the confusion and distress among ordinary people. For generations, they had relied on icons for their spiritual life. A soldier going to war would pray before an icon of Saint George. A sick person would light a candle before an icon of the Virgin. A merchant would invoke the protection of a saint's image before a long journey. Now, suddenly, these familiar objects of devotion were declared impious, instruments of sin, and were being violently removed or defaced by imperial agents. The act of smashing an icon was not merely an administrative order, it was seen by many as a direct assault on their faith, a desecration of the holy. The theological arguments of the iconoclasts, though often presented in dense treatises, revolved around a few key points. Idolatry. As mentioned, the primary charge was that venerating images constituted a return to pagan idolatry, a violation of the first commandment. They argued that icons, being human creations, could not truly depict the divine essence of God or Christ and the nature of Christ. A more sophisticated theological argument centered on the incarnation. Iconoclasts argued that depicting Christ in an icon either limited his divinity if only his human nature was depicted, or implied that his divine nature could be circumscribed and contained by matter if both were depicted, which they saw as Nestorian or Monophysite heresy, respectively. For them, the only true icon of Christ was the Eucharist, the bread and wine of communion, up the roll of the senses. Many iconoclasts believed that true worship should be purely spiritual, devoid of reliance on the material and the visual, which they viewed as distractions or potential traps for the soul. They advocated for a more intellectual and abstract form of piety. The iconoclast emperors, particularly Leo III and his son Constantine, 5th reigned 741-775 CE, were deeply committed to this theological position. Constantine V, known as Copronymus by his detractors, meaning dung-named, was a brilliant military strategist and a formidable theologian in his own right. He convened the Council of Hieria in 754 CE, which officially condemned icon veneration as idolatry and heresy. This council, while later rejected by the Orthodox Church, represented the pinnacle of official iconoclast power, solidifying their theological arguments and providing imperial sanction for the destruction of images. The implementation of iconoclasm was a bureaucratic and often violent process. Imperial officials and soldiers would enter churches and monasteries, systematically destroying icons, often painting over frescoes or whitewashing entire walls. Monks, who were often the most fervent defenders of icons, faced severe persecution, including torture, mutilation, and execution. Many fled to Italy or other regions where icon veneration was still permitted. The conflict thus became a bitter struggle, not just over images, but over the nature of religious authority. Did the emperor have the right to dictate theological doctrine, or did that authority rest with the church councils and the patriarchs? This fundamental question of power would continue to simmer beneath the surface of the theological debate. What were the broader political and social ramifications of such an intense internal religious conflict? And how would this division within the empire affect its ability to face external threats? The iconoclast controversy was not a single, continuous period of persecution and destruction. Rather, it was a protracted struggle marked by distinct phases, periods of intense imperial pressure, followed by periods of reaction and restoration. This ebb and flow reveals the deep societal divisions the debate created, the enduring power of popular piety, and the complex interplay between imperial will, ecclesiastical authority, and the unwavering conviction of ordinary Byzantines. The subtle shifts in policy, the nuanced theological arguments, and the quiet acts of resistance all contribute to a picture of a society deeply polarized by the unseen battles over sacred images. The first phase of iconoclasm, initiated by Leo III and aggressively pursued by his son Constantine V, lasted for several decades. Constantine V, in particular, was relentless. He saw himself as a reformer, purifying the church from what he considered superstitious practices. His theological arguments were sophisticated for their time, and he was successful in rallying a significant portion of the army and the imperial elite to his cause. The Council of Hieria in 754 CE, though later deemed invalid by iconophile councils, effectively served as an imperial synod, giving a semblance of ecclesiastical legitimacy to the iconoclast position. The systematic destruction of icons continued, and iconophile monks, who were often the most vocal and resilient defenders of images, faced particularly harsh repression, including forced marriages, public humiliation, and torture. Many fled to Italy, creating a growing rift between the Byzantine Church and the papacy in Rome, which largely remained iconophile. Imagine the daily life in Constantinople during this period. The vibrant, colorful icons that once adorned public spaces and private homes were replaced by crosses, nature scenes, or secular imagery. If anything at all, the visual landscape of faith was starkly altered. People who clung to their icons might hide them or pray to them in secret, constantly fearing denunciation by zealots or imperial officials. The tension in communities must have been palpable, with neighbors watching neighbors and families potentially divided over their theological allegiances. It was a war of ideas and loyalties, fought not on battlefields, but in the intimate spaces of homes and hearts. However, the complete eradication of icon veneration proved impossible. Its roots in popular piety were too deep, and resistance, though often passive, was widespread. Monasteries, even under persecution, continued to produce and safeguard icons in secret. The common people, especially women, remained devoted to their traditional forms of worship. This widespread popular sentiment combined with a pragmatic need for political stability, eventually led to a shift in imperial policy. The first major reversal came with Empress Irene, who ruled as regent for her young son Constantine VI from 780 to 797 CE. Irene was a devout iconophile, deeply committed to restoring the veneration of images. Her motivations were complex: genuine piety, a desire to heal the schism with the papacy and the Western Church, and possibly a means to undermine the powerful iconoclast faction within the army and bureaucracy that had supported her predecessors. She carefully orchestrated the return to icon veneration, knowing she faced considerable opposition from powerful elements within the military and the church. Her most significant act was the convocation of the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 CE. This council, unlike Hieraea, was recognized by both the Eastern and Western churches as the Seventh Ecumenical Council. It formally condemned iconoclasm as a heresy and unequivocally affirmed the veneration of icons. Crucially, it clarified the distinction between latreia worship, due only to God, and proskynesis veneration or reverence, which could be offered to images as a means of honoring the prototype. This theological nuance was vital in legitimizing icon veneration and distinguishing it from idolatry. The council's decrees led to the official restoration of icons in churches and homes throughout the empire. The vibrant visual culture of Byzantium, momentarily suppressed, began to flourish once more. Yet, this first restoration was not permanent. After a period of iconophile rule, iconoclasm re-emerged in the early 9th century, marking the second phase of the controversy. Emperor Leo V, the Armenian, reigned 813–820 CE, revived the policy, likely driven by a combination of factors: military defeats that he, like Leo III, interpreted as divine displeasure, the lingering influence of iconoclast theology within the army, and a desire to assert imperial control over the church. This second wave of iconoclasm was generally less brutal than the first, focusing more on theological debates and official prescription rather than widespread physical destruction of icons or systematic persecution of iconophiles. Nevertheless, it led to another period of tension and suppression for icon venerators, and the imperial authorities once again sought to remove or deface images. This second iconoclast period lasted for approximately 3 decades. The daily life of Byzantines once again shifted, with icons being hidden, replaced, or simply avoided in public. The theological arguments continued to rage, with the intellectuals on both sides publishing treatises and engaging in fierce debates. The iconophiles, however, continued to gain strength, bolstered by the steadfastness of the monastic communities and the quiet adherence of the popular majority. The theological clarity provided by the Second Council of Nicaea also gave them a stronger, more coherent intellectual framework for their defense of images. The final end of iconoclasm came in 843 CE, under the regency of Empress Theodora, acting for her young son, Michael III. Like Irene, Theodora was a devout iconophile. She recognized the destructive internal divisions caused by the controversy and, with the support of Patriarch Methodius, moved decisively to restore icon veneration permanently. This event, known as the Triumph of Orthodoxy, is still celebrated annually in the Eastern Orthodox Church on the first Sunday of Lent. It marked the definitive victory of the iconophile position and the final cessation of state-sponsored iconoclasm. The icons were once again brought forth, solemnly processed through the streets, and placed back in their rightful positions in churches. The visual landscape of Byzantine worship, so long contested, was finally settled. But what were the lasting, perhaps unseen, impacts of this prolonged and bitter theological struggle on Byzantine society, its relationship with the West, and its enduring identity? The iconoclast controversy, though seemingly a theological squabble over religious art, left deep and lasting scars on the Byzantine Empire, fundamentally shaping its religious identity, its relationship with the Western world, and even its internal political dynamics. The resolution of the conflict in 843 CE, celebrated as the triumph of orthodoxy, did not simply erase the memory of a century of strife. It redefined what it meant to be an Orthodox Christian and subtly redirected the empire's focus, highlighting how seemingly abstract theological debates could have profoundly concrete and enduring consequences. One of the most immediate and significant impacts of the controversy was the permanent deepening of the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. During the first phase of iconoclasm, the papacy in Rome, consistently iconophile, condemned the imperial policies of Constantinople. This disagreement over a core theological issue, coupled with existing linguistic and cultural differences, further estranged Rome from Byzantium, while formal schism, the Great Schism of 1054, was still centuries away. The iconoclast controversy created a significant theological and political wedge. The Pope increasingly looked to the Frankish rulers in the West for protection and legitimacy, culminating in the coronation of Charlemagne as emperor in 800 CE, an act that Constantinople viewed as a direct challenge to its universal imperial authority. This shift in alliances and allegiances, driven in part by a dispute over images, had monumental consequences for the future geopolitical landscape of Europe. Within the Byzantine Empire itself, the controversy strengthened the role and influence of monasticism. Monks were the most fervent and uncompromising defenders of icons, enduring severe persecution for their beliefs. Their steadfastness, often leading to martyrdom or exile, solidified their moral authority and popular respect. After the triumph of orthodoxy, monasteries experienced a resurgence, becoming centers of artistic production, especially icon painting, theological scholarship, and spiritual guidance. Their resistance to imperial decrees demonstrated a powerful counterweight to imperial religious authority, reinforcing the idea that fundamental theological matters ultimately rested with the Church and its councils, not solely with the emperor. This balance of power, though often precarious, would be a defining feature of the Byzantine church-state relationship thereafter. The controversy also had a profound impact on Byzantine art. While iconoclasm led to the destruction of countless early icons and frescoes, its resolution spurred a renewed burst of artistic creativity. The theological distinctions made by the Second Council of Nicaea, particularly the precise definition of veneration, provided a clear theological framework for artistic production. This led to a more standardized and formalized iconographic tradition, with strict rules governing the depiction of sacred figures and scenes. Byzantine art, while retaining its profound spiritual depth, became highly symbolic and less overtly naturalistic, emphasizing the transcendent rather than the immanent. This systematic approach to iconography ensured a consistent visual language of faith across the empire, reinforcing Orthodox doctrine and distinguishing it from both Western Roman Catholic and Islamic artistic traditions. The boring details of artistic conventions, such as prescribed color palettes and specific poses, were in fact theological statements carefully crafted to convey specific doctrines economically and socially. The controversy caused significant disruption. The confiscation of monastic properties during iconoclast periods and their subsequent restoration had considerable economic implications. The flow of people, including monks fleeing persecution, contributed to intellectual and artistic movements in areas beyond imperial control. The intense internal focus on this theological debate also diverted imperial resources and attention at a time when the empire faced relentless external pressures, particularly from the Arabs and the Bulgarians. This internal strife undoubtedly weakened the empire's ability to respond effectively to these threats. Though it is difficult to quantify precisely, theological education and literacy also received a boost. The need to articulate complex arguments for or against icons led to a flourishing of theological writing. Both sides produced voluminous treatises requiring a literate clergy and an educated elite. This intellectual ferment, while contentious, contributed to the overall intellectual vibrancy of Byzantine society for the ordinary person. The controversy undoubtedly sharpened their understanding of their faith. They were forced to consider, perhaps for the first time in such detail, what an icon truly meant, how it related to God, and why it was worth defending. This deeper engagement with theological concepts, however agonizing, contributed to a more robust popular piety. Ultimately, the triumph of orthodoxy forged a distinct and enduring Byzantine identity. The iconophile's victory solidified the unique character of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, emphasizing the veneration of images as an integral part of worship and a tangible link to the divine. This strong emphasis on visual theology, on the seen aspect of faith, became a hallmark of Orthodox spirituality, differentiating it sharply from the Latin West. The controversy, in essence, forced Byzantium to look inward, to define its own theological boundaries, and in doing so, it reinforced its sense of unique destiny and purpose as the guardian of true Christian belief. The scars of the conflict may have remained, but from them emerged a more clearly defined, more resilient, and more distinct Byzantine Orthodox worldview that would endure long after the empire itself faded from the map. What does this long and arduous struggle over the interpretation of sacred imagery tell us about the human need for visual representation in worship? And how does it inform our modern understanding of religious symbols and their power to unite or divide? The Varangian Guard, beyond the axe, the daily grind of imperial bodyguards. The Varangian Guard, the elite personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors from the late 10th to the early 15th century, conjures images of towering, axe-wielding Northmen, fierce and loyal, exotic mercenaries serving a distant, opulent emperor. While the romanticized image holds a kernel of truth, the reality of their existence was far more complex, encompassing arduous journeys, meticulous bureaucratic integration, and the constant, often tedious, duties of guarding the most powerful man in the Christian East. To truly appreciate the boring yet vital details of their lives, one must understand the forces that drew these Norse, Russes, and later Anglo-Saxon warriors from their distant homelands to the glittering yet dangerous heart of the Byzantine Empire. Imagine, if you will, a young man in 10th century Scandinavia, perhaps from a farming village or a minor chieftain's family, listening to tales of Miklagardr, the great city, a place of unimaginable wealth and opportunity far to the south. Life in the Norse lands was often harsh, characterized by limited resources, incessant feuds, and the ever-present temptation of raiding. While the allure of plunder was strong, there was also a growing understanding of more formalized mercenary service. Byzantine gold, famously pure and plentiful nomisma, or hyperpyron, was a powerful magnet, promising a life of riches beyond anything achievable in their native lands. For many, joining the Varangian Guard was not just an adventure. It was a pragmatic economic decision, a path to accumulating enough wealth to return home as a respected, perhaps even land-owning individual. The journey itself was a colossal undertaking, fraught with danger and demanding immense physical and mental fortitude. For the Norse and Rus's recruits, the primary route was the fabled route from the Varangians to the Greeks, a network of rivers and portages stretching from the Baltic Sea down through modern-day Russia and Ukraine to the Black Sea. This was no leisurely cruise. Imagine navigating treacherous rapids, portaging heavy longboats overland for miles through dense forests, and constantly being on guard against hostile Slavic tribes or Pecheneg nomads. The journey could take months, even a year, and many would not survive the perils of nature, disease, or banditry. For those who completed it, the very act of arrival in Constantinople was a testament to their resilience and determination. Upon arrival, these rough-hewn Northmen encountered a world of bewildering sophistication. Constantinople, with its million inhabitants, its grand palaces, its bustling markets, and its intricate bureaucracy, was a stark contrast to their often rural or tribal societies. The recruitment process for the Guard was surprisingly rigorous. It wasn't simply a matter of showing up with an axe. Recruits needed to demonstrate their physical prowess, their loyalty, and their willingness to integrate into the highly disciplined imperial military structure. While their fearsome reputations as warriors preceded them, the Byzantines were shrewd administrators, recognizing that effective bodyguards needed more than brute strength. They needed to be reliable, controllable, and utterly devoted to the emperor. One of the most appealing aspects of joining the Guard was the pay. Varangians received generous salaries, far exceeding what a common soldier in the Byzantine army would earn. Furthermore, they were eligible for significant donatives bonuses, especially upon the accession of a new emperor or after a successful military campaign. These payments were often made in the aforementioned pure gold numismata, coins highly valued across Europe and beyond. This tangible wealth was a key incentive, allowing them to send money back to their families or accumulate capital for their eventual return home. Many Guard members served for a fixed period, perhaps a few years, then returned to their homelands, their newfound wealth solidifying their status. Beyond the monetary compensation, there were other benefits that would have appealed to warriors. The Varangian Guard, as the emperor's personal retinue, enjoyed high prestige. They had direct access to the emperor, lived within the great palace or nearby barracks, and were insulated from some of the more brutal aspects of regular campaigning that afflicted other units. They were fed, clothed, and housed by the state, removing the daily burden of survival that many common soldiers faced. This stability and security, combined with the prospect of glory and wealth, made the Guard a highly coveted position for foreign warriors seeking opportunity. The integration of these foreign elements into the Byzantine military machine was a meticulous bureaucratic process. Records would have been kept of their enlistment, pay, and service, while they retained some of their distinctive cultural practices, such as their preference for the Dane axe. They were expected to conform to Byzantine military discipline and chain of command. They would have been trained in Byzantine tactics, drilled in parade ground formations, and expected to learn at least rudimentary Greek to receive orders. This administrative absorption, often overlooked in romanticized accounts, was crucial for their effectiveness as an imperial unit. They were not simply a band of wild Northmen, they were a highly paid, highly disciplined, and carefully managed component of the Byzantine military establishment. But even with the lure of gold and the promise of prestige, what were the day-to-day realities of life, guarding an emperor perpetually beset by internal intrigues and external threats? And how did their foreignness become both a strength and a potential vulnerability? Once within the walls of Constantinople and officially enlisted, the life of a Varangian Guard member transformed from the perils of the journey to the intricate, often monotonous, routines of imperial service. Their duties extended far beyond merely standing guard with their formidable axes. They were integral to the daily functioning and security of the great palace, a role that demanded strict discipline, unwavering loyalty, and an understanding of the subtle yet deadly currents of Byzantine court intrigue, the seemingly boring details of their daily grind, the patrols, the ceremonial duties, the constant readiness were, in fact, the essential elements that sustained the emperor's personal safety and, by extension, the stability of the entire empire. The Varangian Guard was not simply a standing army. They were the emperor's personal household troops, operating within the most intimate and politically charged spaces of the Byzantine state. Their primary duty was to protect the emperor at all times. This meant constant vigilance. Imagine a Varangian standing motionless for hours, a sentinel guarding the doors to the imperial chambers, his hand resting on the haft of his axe, his senses alert to every whisper, every shadow, every subtle shift in the palace's intricate human tapestry. They provided security during imperial processions, ensuring the emperor's safety as he moved through the bustling streets of Constantinople, and stood sentry during public appearances. Their imposing presence, a clear deterrent to any would-be assassins or disgruntled citizens. Beyond these overt security roles, the Varangians were also a crucial force in maintaining order within the great palace itself. The Byzantine court was a viper's nest of ambition, conspiracy, and betrayal. Eunuchs, powerful ministers, rival noble families, and even members of the imperial family constantly vied for influence, and plots against the reigning emperor were not uncommon. The Varangians, by virtue of their foreignness, were considered more reliable than native Byzantine troops, who might have personal loyalties or family ties that could compromise their allegiance. They had no local allegiances within the capital's Byzantine factions. Their loyalty bought with gold and secured by their oath directly to the emperor himself. This detachment made them ideal enforcers of imperial will, particularly in moments of crisis. Their daily routine would have been highly structured. Guard duties were organized into shifts, likely round the clock, with specific posts assigned throughout the sprawling palace complex, at gates, along corridors, outside private apartments, and within the various administrative wings. Drills and physical training would have been constant, maintaining their physical prowess and ensuring they remained adept with their weapons, particularly their iconic Dane axes, massive two-handed weapons that were both symbols of their identity and devastating instruments of war. While their primary weapon was the axe, they were also skilled with swords, spears, and bows, making them versatile fighters. Their distinctive appearance, often wearing chainmail, conical helmets, and carrying their large axes, would have made them instantly recognizable, a visible manifestation of imperial power and protection. Ceremonial duties also formed a significant part of their service. As the emperor's personal guard, they participated in elaborate court rituals, imperial parades, and state ceremonies. Their imposing stature and foreign appearance added to the spectacle and grandeur of the Byzantine court, impressing foreign dignitaries and local populace alike. While seemingly mundane, these ceremonial roles were vital to projecting the image of a powerful and secure emperor, reinforcing the imperial mystique. Standing motionless for hours during a tedious court ceremony, however, was as much a test of discipline as facing an enemy in battle. Despite their perceived unswerving loyalty, the Varangians were not entirely immune to the complex political currents of Byzantium. While less prone to betraying the emperor for a Byzantine faction, their loyalty was ultimately to the imperial office, not necessarily to a specific individual. There are instances where the guard, or elements within it, played a role in dynastic struggles, supporting one claimant over another if they believed it was in their best interest or aligned with their oath. However, these instances were rare and usually occurred when the legitimacy of the reigning emperor was severely compromised. Their core principle remained direct protection of the emperor against all enemies, foreign or domestic. Life for a Varangian in Constantinople also involved cultural adaptation. While they maintained their distinct Norse or Anglo-Saxon identity, they lived in the most cosmopolitan city of the medieval world. They would have interacted daily with Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, and people from countless other cultures. While some would have remained insular, many would have learned rudimentary Greek, participated in local markets, and perhaps even married local women, gradually integrating into certain aspects of Byzantine society outside their barracks. Their letters home, preserved in runic inscriptions, sometimes speak of their experiences in the great city, their accumulating wealth, and their longing for their homelands. The Varangian Guards' enduring reputation for fierce loyalty was often cemented in battle. When the emperor himself led campaigns, the Varangians formed the imperial reserve, the last line of defense, and the spearhead of decisive charges. Their disciplined fury in combat was legendary, striking fear into the hearts of Byzantine enemies. This readiness for battle, even when not actively campaigning, was a constant undercurrent to their palace duties. Every drill, every patrol, Every moment of vigilance contributed to their effectiveness when the true test came, but even their formidable presence and unwavering loyalty could not always guarantee the outcome of Byzantine political struggles or the ultimate fate of the empire. What eventually led to the decline of this legendary guard, and how did their story, from distant lands to imperial service, eventually fade into the long, quiet annals of history? The formidable Varangian Guard, for centuries a cornerstone of Byzantine imperial security and a fearsome sight to the empire's enemies, did not vanish overnight. Its decline was a slow, protracted process, mirroring the gradual weakening of the Byzantine Empire itself. Economic shifts, changing geopolitical realities, the rise of internal factions, and the slow erosion of the empire's ability to attract and sustain such an elite foreign force all contributed to the fading of the Varangian axe from the corridors of the Great Palace. The meticulous details of their eventual marginalization reveal not a dramatic fall, but a quiet, almost imperceptible dissipation, an end to a remarkable era of mercenary loyalty. In its heyday, the Varangian Guard primarily comprised Norsemen and Rus, drawing from a wellspring of Viking adventurers. However, by the 11th and 12th centuries, the dynamics of Northern Europe began to change. The Christianization of Scandinavia led to the establishment of more stable monarchies, and the Viking Age, with its tradition of overseas adventuring, gradually subsided. While individual warriors still sought their fortunes abroad, the sheer volume of recruits from these regions diminished. This demographic shift forced the Byzantines to look elsewhere for their elite foreign contingent. The most significant change in the Guard's composition came after the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Thousands of Anglo-Saxon warriors, displaced and dispossessed by William the Conqueror, sought new lives and opportunities. Many of these experienced and fiercely independent fighters found their way to Constantinople, drawn by the same lure of gold and prestigious service that had attracted the Norsemen centuries before. The Varangian Guard became increasingly Anglo-Varangian, with the Anglo-Saxon cultural elements and fighting styles like their preference for the two-handed axe gradually becoming predominant. This infusion of new blood prolonged the Guard's life and maintained its fearsome reputation for a time, but it also signaled a shift away from its original Norse identity. As the Byzantine Empire entered its later centuries, particularly after the devastating Fourth Crusade of 1204, its economic and military capacity waned dramatically. The sack of Constantinople by the Latin Crusaders was a catastrophic blow, shattering the imperial treasury, dispersing its wealth, and permanently crippling its ability to project power. The restored Byzantine Empire, after 1261, was a mere shadow of its former self, a regional power struggling for survival rather than a dominant force. This decline directly impacted the Varangian Guard. The generous salaries and donatives that had once attracted the best foreign warriors became increasingly difficult for the impoverished emperors to maintain. While the Guard continued to exist, its numbers dwindled significantly. By the late 13th and 14th centuries, the Guard was often smaller, less numerous, and perhaps less rigorously recruited than in its prime. The boring details of imperial finance, the dwindling revenue from lost territories, and the constant need to pay for other, often more pressing, military expenses meant that the Varangians were no longer the uniquely pampered elite they once were. Furthermore, the very nature of warfare changed. While the Varangian axe remained a formidable weapon in close quarters combat, the increasing prominence of gunpowder and more complex siege warfare rendered individual prowess, while still important, less decisive than in earlier periods. The Byzantines also began to rely more heavily on other types of mercenaries, often from Italy, Genoese, Venetians, or the Balkans, who might be cheaper or more readily available. The prestige of the Guard also suffered. As the empire itself diminished, so too did the aura of the emperor it served. The political instability of the later Paleologan dynasty, marked by frequent civil wars and dynastic squabbles, meant that the Varangians were sometimes caught in internal conflicts that tested their loyalty in ways their predecessors might not have faced. Their strict adherence to loyalty to the emperor, rather than a specific individual, could lead to difficult choices during periods of usurpation. By the 15th century, on the eve of Constantinople's final fall in 1453, the Varangian Guard was a mere vestige of its former glory. While there may have been a small contingent of foreign guards still present, possibly Genoese or Venetian mercenaries, the iconic Norse or Anglo-Saxon axe-bearers had largely vanished. The last reliable mention of the Varangian Guard as a distinct fighting unit dates to the early 15th century. In the desperate final defense of Constantinople in 1453, there were indeed foreign fighters, but they were a mixed bag of volunteers and mercenaries, no longer a coherent, distinct guard in the traditional sense, their numbers too few to make a decisive difference against the overwhelming Ottoman forces and their terrifying new cannons. The story of the Varangian Guard is a subtle lesson in the interplay of economic realities, geopolitical shifts, and the simple passage of time. They were a testament to the Byzantine Empire's ingenuity in harnessing foreign manpower and loyalty, a practice almost unique for its effectiveness over such a long period. Their decline was not due to a single defeat or a sudden betrayal, but to the slow, relentless erosion of the empire's ability to maintain the conditions that had attracted and sustained them. The echoes of their presence, however, lingered in Byzantine historical accounts and in runic inscriptions found in faraway lands, remnants of lives lived far from home, bound by an oath to a distant emperor and the promise of gold. Their tale reminds us that even the most celebrated and exotic elements of history often have a mundane, quiet end, fading away not with a bang, but with the slow whisper of diminishing resources and shifting global priorities. What does the fading of such a remarkable military unit tell us about the ephemeral nature of even the most powerful institutions when the underlying foundations that support them begin to crumble? The Great Schism of 1054, when bureaucracy and pride divided a faith. The Great Schism of 1054, the formal break between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, is often portrayed as a dramatic, singular event, encapsulated by the mutual excommunications exchanged between Cardinal Humbert and Patriarch Michael Cerularius. While these excommunications were indeed the bureaucratic and symbolic climax, they were merely the final, bitter flourish of a process that had been unfolding over many centuries. A slow, quiet drifting apart, born of linguistic differences, theological nuances, evolving political structures, and, perhaps most importantly, a pervasive sense of cultural and ecclesiastical pride. To truly understand this boring but profoundly significant division, one must meticulously trace the accumulated grievances and subtle divergences that preceded the formal rupture. Imagine the early Christian world, initially united in faith, but geographically and culturally diverse. As the Roman Empire expanded, Latin became the dominant language in the West, while Greek remained the lingua franca of the East. This seemingly minor linguistic divergence had profound implications. Over time, the subtle nuances of theological concepts, when translated from one language to another, could take on slightly different meanings, leading to misunderstandings rather than deliberate doctrinal conflicts. For instance, the Latin concept of filioque and the Son, added to the Nicene Creed in the West to describe the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father and the Son, was not present in the original Greek creed. While the West saw this as a clarification, the East viewed it as an unauthorized alteration of a universal creed established by ecumenical councils, and a theological innovation that potentially undermined the unique role of the Father as the sole source of divinity. This single phrase would become one of the most contentious points of theological dispute, not because of its inherent complexity, but because of its symbolic representation of divergent theological authority and interpretation beyond language. The political trajectories of the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire diverged dramatically after the fall of Rome in 476 CE. In the West, the collapse of imperial authority left a power vacuum that the papacy gradually filled, becoming not just a spiritual leader, but also a crucial temporal authority, negotiating with barbarian kings and establishing a visible, centralized ecclesiastical structure. The Pope's authority grew steadily, asserting universal jurisdiction over all Christians, a claim rooted in the Petrine succession saint, Peter as the first bishop of Rome. In the East, however, the Byzantine Empire continued to thrive, and the emperor remained a powerful figure, seen as God's representative on earth and the protector of the Church. The Patriarch of Constantinople, while wielding immense influence, operated within a system of Caesaropapism, where the emperor often played a significant role in ecclesiastical affairs, convening councils and even influencing theological debates. The Eastern Church developed a pentarchy, a system recognizing 5 major patriarchates: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem as holding primary authority, with Rome holding a primacy of honor, but not necessarily universal juridical supremacy. This fundamental difference in the understanding of ecclesiastical authority, the Pope's universal jurisdiction versus the pentarchy and the emperor's role, was a deep-seated, simmering disagreement that consistently fueled tensions. Liturgical and ritual differences also accumulated over centuries. While seemingly minor to an outsider, these variations were deeply meaningful to the adherents of each tradition. The use of unleavened bread, host for the Eucharist in the West versus leavened bread in the East. The different styles of fasting, the celibacy of priests in the West versus the allowance for married priests before ordination in the East. The use of icons in the East, which, as we discussed, caused its own internal Byzantine controversy versus different forms of sacred art in the West. Each of these practices developed organically within their respective cultural contexts, contributed to a growing sense of otherness, An Eastern monk visiting a Western monastery might be subtly disturbed by the unfamiliar rituals, and vice versa. These weren't heresies, but they were distinctions that, over time, began to feel significant, becoming markers of diverging identities. The perceived lack of respect from one side to the other further exacerbated these differences. Western popes, in their communications, often failed to fully acknowledge the authority or theological sophistication of the Eastern patriarchs, treating them as subordinates. Eastern emperors and patriarchs, in turn, often viewed the West as culturally backward, grappling with barbarian invasions, and theologically unsophisticated. The coronation of Charlemagne as emperor by the Pope in 800 CE, seen by the Byzantines as a direct usurpation of their universal Roman imperial title, was a stark political affront that perfectly encapsulated this growing disdain. By the 11th century, these accumulated differences, though rarely leading to outright theological condemnation of each other, created a climate of suspicion and mutual incomprehension. Each side increasingly viewed the other through a lens of subtle prejudice and misunderstanding. The stage was set for a dramatic, if somewhat anticlimactic, bureaucratic clash that would make these quiet differences into an official, enduring division. What specific events and what singular personalities would ultimately bring these long simmering tensions to a head, forcing an official rupture that had been decades, if not centuries, in the making? The Great Schism of 1054, while a culmination of centuries of gradual estrangement, was ultimately triggered by a series of specific, intensely personal clashes of ego and authority. Set against a backdrop of complex political maneuvering, it was not a grand theological debate that led to the final break, but rather a diplomatic mission gone terribly wrong, revealing how easily human pride and bureaucratic inflexibility could formalize an already deep-seated division. The seemingly boring details of diplomatic protocol, power plays, and the precise wording of official documents were, in this instance, the instruments that tore apart the ancient Christian world. The immediate catalyst for the 1054 schism was the assertive, even aggressive, policies of Patriarch Michael Cerularius of Constantinople, Patriarch from 1043 to 1058 CE. Cerularius was a proud and fiercely independent prelate, deeply resentful of any perceived infringements on the authority of his see. He viewed the Latin practices with suspicion and considered the papacy's claims of universal jurisdiction as an unacceptable affront to the traditional pentarchy of patriarchates, in which Constantinople held a unique position as the new Rome. In 1053, Cerularius took a provocative step. He ordered the closure of Latin churches in Constantinople, and even went so far as to have the Latin liturgical practices denounced, particularly the use of unleavened bread for the Eucharist, which he considered a Jewish practice and therefore heretical. This was a clear challenge, a deliberate escalation designed to assert Byzantine ecclesiastical independence. Simultaneously, political pressures were mounting. In southern Italy, Byzantine territories were under threat from the Normans. Pope Leo IX, facing the same Norman expansion into papal lands, sought an alliance with the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX Monomachus to counter the common threat. The emperor, pragmatic and eager for military assistance, was willing to seek reconciliation with Rome. He therefore encouraged Pope Leo IX to send an embassy to Constantinople to resolve the brewing disputes. The Pope dispatched a three-man delegation to Constantinople in early 1054, led by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida. Humbert was a formidable figure, intelligent, learned, but also notoriously arrogant, dogmatic, and utterly uncompromising. He held a dim view of Eastern theology and customs, considering them inferior or even heretical. Crucially, Humbert arrived in Constantinople bearing papal bulls letters that stated Pope Leo IX claimed universal jurisdiction over all patriarchs, including the Patriarch of Constantinople. This assertion, profoundly offensive to Cerularius and the Byzantine ecclesiastical tradition, set the stage for inevitable confrontation. From the moment of their arrival, the embassy was plagued by miscommunication and mutual disdain. Humbert treated Cerularius with thinly veiled contempt, refusing to recognize his patriarchal title and demanding subservience. Cerularius, equally proud and unwilling to be lectured by a Western cardinal, met Humbert's arrogance with calculated coolness, refusing to grant him the customary formal audience. The two men, representing their respective traditions, epitomized the very pride and inflexibility that had slowly driven their churches apart. This wasn't a meeting of open minds seeking compromise. It was a confrontation between two immovable objects. The theological debate quickly devolved into an exchange of insults and accusations rather than reasoned discussion. Humbert and his fellow legates publicly attacked various Eastern practices, including married clergy and the filioque clause, but did so in a manner that seemed deliberately provocative and disrespectful. Cerularius, for his part, refused to back down, publishing his own condemnations of Latin practices and accusing the Westerners of theological errors. The entire diplomatic mission spiraled into a personal feud between two strong-willed, uncompromising individuals. The situation came to a head on July 16th, 1054. On that Saturday afternoon, Cardinal Humbert, exasperated by Cerularius's refusal to meet with him and convinced of the patriarch's obstinacy, marched into the Hagia Sophia, the magnificent cathedral of Constantinople. As the clergy were preparing for the divine liturgy, Humbert laid a bull of excommunication on the main altar. This document, personally drafted by Humbert and of questionable validity, as Pope Leo IX had actually died months earlier, and thus Humbert had no legitimate authority to excommunicate in his name, formally excommunicated Michael Cerularius and his supporters. The bull was a blistering indictment, accusing the Patriarch of heresy on multiple grounds, including the removal of the filioque from the creed which, ironically, the Byzantines had never accepted in the first place, and the practice of married clergy. Imagine the shock and horror of the Byzantine clergy and congregation witnessing this audacious act. It was an unprecedented insult, a grave breach of religious and diplomatic protocol, committed in the heart of Eastern Orthodoxy. Humbert and his legates then dramatically left the city, shaking the dust off their feet, symbolically washing their hands of the Byzantines. Cerularius, predictably, responded with fury. On July 20th, 1054, in a synod of the Byzantine Church, he issued his own bull of anathema, formally excommunicating Cardinal Humbert and his fellow legates. It carefully avoided excommunicating the Pope himself or the entire Western Church, instead focusing on the specific individuals and their perceived errors and arrogance. This was a critical distinction, as neither side initially believed they were definitively splitting from the entire body of Christianity, but rather condemning what they saw as the errant actions of certain individuals. The mutual excommunications, though issued with questionable authority and primarily targeting individuals, were nevertheless a profound symbolic rupture. They transformed a long standing pattern of estrangement into an official, undeniable division. What was once a gradual drift became an abrupt break, a bureaucratic separation with immense and unforeseen consequences for the future of Christianity. What were the lasting theological, political, and cultural implications of this bitter, pride driven divorce? And how did it fundamentally reshape the spiritual landscape of Europe for centuries to come? The mutual excommunications of 1054, though seemingly a contained incident involving a few prideful individuals, were far from an isolated event. They were the bureaucratic crystallizing point of centuries of accumulated differences, and their immediate aftermath, along with the subsequent historical developments, cemented the Great Schism into a profound and enduring divide between Eastern and Western Christianity. This wasn't merely a theological disagreement, it became a deep-seated cultural, political, and even emotional alienation, demonstrating how an initial bureaucratic rupture could blossom into a seemingly unbridgeable chasm that continues to shape religious and geopolitical landscapes even today. Initially, neither side considered the excommunications of 1054 to be a permanent, universal schism. Many believed it was a personal dispute between Cardinal Humbert and Patriarch Cerularius, and that the wider churches remained in communion. Indeed, occasional attempts at reconciliation were made in the centuries that followed. However, the events of 1054 served as a potent symbol, a reference point for subsequent arguments, and a clear signal that the two halves of Christendom were indeed on divergent paths. The boring details of diplomatic failures and prideful pronouncements had, in fact, laid the foundation for a permanent separation. One of the most significant long-term consequences was the increasing theological divergence. While the Filioque clause was a primary point of contention, the schism allowed for the independent development of distinct theological emphases. The West, influenced by scholasticism, focused on systematic theology, legalistic interpretations of sin and salvation, and the development of papal supremacy. The East, rooted in patristic tradition, emphasized mystical theology, theosis deification, and the role of the ecumenical councils in defining doctrine. These differing approaches to understanding God and salvation, while not necessarily contradictory, became increasingly distinct and, without regular dialogue, often appeared alien to the other side. Imagine two branches of a family, speaking different dialects, developing different customs, and eventually finding it difficult to understand each other's core values. The political consequences were equally profound. With the formal break, the Byzantine Empire lost a potential ally in the West against common enemies, particularly the rising power of the Seljuk Turks. Conversely, the papacy, free from the direct influence of Constantinople, solidified its temporal power in Western Europe, forging alliances with emerging kingdoms and asserting its spiritual authority over secular rulers. This led to the investiture controversy in the West, where the Pope challenged the emperor's right to appoint bishops, a struggle that would have been unthinkable in the Caesaro-Papist context of Byzantium. The Crusades, ostensibly launched to aid the Eastern Christians against the Seljuks, ironically served to deepen the schism rather than heal it. The First Crusade, late 11th century, saw Western armies pass through Byzantine territory, often causing friction and suspicion. However, the most devastating blow was the Fourth Crusade in 1204, which, as discussed earlier, brutally sacked Constantinople. This act of unprovoked aggression by Latin Christians against the capital of Eastern Orthodoxy was an unforgivable betrayal. It solidified the Byzantine view of Westerners as rapacious barbarians and cemented an enduring bitterness that transcended theological disputes. The image of Western knights plundering Hagia Sophia and desecrating holy relics was seared into the collective memory of the Byzantines, rendering any future attempts at reconciliation incredibly difficult. For the ordinary Byzantine, the theological differences now had a brutal, tangible manifestation economically. The schism contributed to the decline of Byzantine trade dominance in the Mediterranean as Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa gained increasing influence, often at Constantinople's expense. The cultural consequences were equally significant. Two distinct Christian civilizations developed, each with its own artistic styles, liturgical music, and intellectual traditions. The shared heritage of the early church became filtered through divergent lenses, leading to a sense of us versus them that permeated all levels of society. Even today, nearly a millennium later, the Great Schism remains largely unrepaired. While relations between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches have significantly improved, particularly since the mid-20th century, with the mutual lifting of the anathemas of 1054 in 1965 by Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras Ristes. Fundamental theological and ecclesiological differences persist. The question of papal primacy, the filioque clause, and the role of ecumenical councils remain significant hurdles to full communion. The story of the Great Schism is a stark reminder that history is not just made by grand battles or heroic figures, but also by the seemingly dry details of theological nuance, bureaucratic posturing, and the insidious power of human pride and misunderstanding. It teaches us that centuries of quiet divergence can culminate in a formal rupture, and that once a division is codified, however minor it may initially appear, it can gain a life of its own, generating layers of resentment and alienation that prove incredibly difficult to dismantle. The Christian world remains divided by an event that, at its core, was as much about diplomatic failure and individual stubbornness as it was about profound religious conviction. What does this long and enduring division reveal about the profound human need for distinct identity, even within shared spiritual traditions? And how does the history of this schism inform our understanding of seemingly intractable conflicts in the modern world? Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan to some soothing background music, and let's conclude our journey tonight. The Byzantine Empire, often dismissed as a mere continuation of Rome, a footnote in the grander sweep of history, was in fact a realm of profound, enduring resilience, shaped by a fascinating interplay of mundane details and monumental events. Tonight, we have drifted through the enduring embrace of its Theodosian walls, built by the patient hands of thousands, a silent sentinel against centuries of invasion, only to yield to the relentless march of technological innovation and infernal decay. We have explored the bureaucratic mechanisms behind the Edict of Milan, a pragmatic turning point that transformed a persecuted faith into an imperial pillar, only to witness how imperial patronage itself could bind the church in golden chains. We observed the painstaking scholarly labor that gave us Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, a dry collection of legal texts that, against all odds, would lay the foundation for legal systems across continents, a testament to the quiet power of ordered thought. We journeyed into the unseen lives of the Byzantine countryside, the anonymous peasants whose endless toil sustained an empire, their daily grind a testament to quiet endurance in the face of plague and invasion. We witnessed the unseen battles of the iconoclast controversy, where theological nuances over sacred images ignited a century of internal strife, shaping both not only religious art, but the very identity of Eastern Orthodoxy and its permanent separation from the West. And finally, we followed the long, winding road of the Varangian Guard, axe-wielding Northmen drawn by Byzantine gold, whose disciplined service and eventual quiet fading reflected the broader ebb and flow of an empire slowly losing its grip on power. Each of these stories, seemingly disparate, weaves into the grand tapestry of a civilization that, for over 1,000 years, demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for survival, for adaptation, and for leaving an indelible, if often overlooked, mark on the course of human history. The boring details of their existence, the intricate bureaucracies, the daily struggles, the subtle shifts in policy, all contributed to an enduring legacy that continues to resonate in the legal systems we live by, the religious traditions we observe, and the very cities that still stand as silent witnesses to their ingenuity and fortitude. Remember, even in the quietest corners of the past, the most seemingly unremarkable details often hold the profoundest truths about who we are and how our world came to be. Good night.